Hi, everyone, and welcome to our first Rancher Meetup of 2018. I am Shannon Williams. I'm here with my co-founder, Darren Shephard, for today's meetup, hands-on with the Rancher 2.0 beta. Darren, how are you doing this morning?
Doing good. Excited to be here.
Okay, good. Awesome. Looks like we have an enormous crowd today. I was tweeting this morning, we had 3,800 people register for this meetup, and there are hundreds and hundreds of you already on from around the world. So hopefully we don't break the 1,000 mark that GoToWebinar caps us at. So if we do, I apologize for anyone who was the last ones on. But we've got a great meetup today for you. We got a lot of content to cover, and hopefully we'll be able to answer a lot of your questions about Rancher 2.0. Talk about where the release is at right now. So first things first, as always, this is a meetup, not a webinar. We are here to engage with every one of you and answer your questions. That means a lot of things, but the most important one is we don't have a time limit on this today's meetup. We're gonna talk as long as we need to answer all of your questions. There is a question tab over on the right-hand side of the GoToWebinar console that allows you to write up questions. I am always reviewing that. We should have, I actually invited Denise, who helps us with our training and is our head of ops here at Rancher, to also join today's meetup just to help. Last time we had so many questions, we really couldn't get to them quick enough. So she's going to help answer some questions. But as you're answering questions, asking questions, I'll be stopping Darren sometimes to ask the questions out loud and sort of may mention you. If your question's really private and you don't want me to say about it or share it with anyone else, please mark like private somewhere in there. Otherwise, I may answer you but reply to everyone so everyone can see your question and see sort of how I answered it. The questions are a great way to just get to sort of see what other people are thinking. Sometimes people ask questions that I don't know the answer to, and I may just say I have no idea, and put it out there to the community. If you know the answer, please answer, and I'll shoot it back out to everyone. So we got lots of questions in the past. They're always great. Don't hesitate to ask a question. Don't feel bad if it takes me a little while to get to your question, though. Sometimes questions are things that I'll be answering that I know we're going to cover in just a few minutes, like how do I upgrade from 1.6 to 2.0, and I may just hold off on responding to it. Or if your question's really on a topic that's maybe more Rancher general, I may answer it at the very end. So just be prepared for that. We kind of think of these things as meetups partly because we don't tend to do a lot of slides. We tend to demo some more. So this is going to be a really hands-on meetup today. For example, we're mostly going to be going through the product, showing you the new Tech Preview 2 that came out today. Given that things sometimes break, be patient. If Darren's having some demo issues and his sacrifices to the demo gods went unheeded, I'll probably take a second to answer a bunch of questions while he goes and reboots something or figures out what exploded on him. So we're pretty transparent with this stuff. So feel free to fire tons of questions at me when he's silently trying to fix things. So with that, I do kind of love to just acknowledge how many awesome people there are out here in the community. We have a Slack channel for Rancher. If you're not already on it, please join it. It is awesome. You can join that. Just Google Rancher for Slack. It's in the product. There's a link to it. It's a great place to chat if you want to have chats. We also talk a lot on Twitter, and I always ask people to introduce themselves and take a picture, show us what you're doing and where you are attending the meetup. These are just some of the awesome people that are on the Twitter program. In fact, I always like to, I wanted to stop today and kind of just ask a really quick poll to kind of get a feel for how much experience everyone has using Rancher. We have so many people here. So I'm just gonna send out a poll out right now. You guys should see it on your screen. The key question is, how much do you already know Rancher? You're just here learning about it now and you're kind of getting going. You've already deployed it, but you're not really using it a lot. You're using it today quite aggressively, or you are a master of all things Rancher. You've really used a ton of it, and you've got a strong experience with it. It looks like we've got 60, 70, 80% of people have voted. Feel free to keep voting. The numbers aren't changing much though, so we've got a pretty good answer, I think. I'm going to close the poll in 3, 2, 2.5, and 1. All right. So there's sort of the answer. You guys should be able to see the results. It looks like it's pretty evenly split. So, out of the hundreds of people here, a lot of people are just kind of learning about Rancher now. Many have it deployed, but not sort of in a central perspective. And then another 30 or 40% using it today pretty heavily. And only 7% of you are true ranch hands, cowboys, and have longtime users. So thanks for doing that. With that, I'll kind of get into today's agenda. What we're going to try to do today is talk about the 2.0 update, give you an idea of where we're at. I'll go through and kind of talk through what we're doing at a high level, what we're trying to accomplish with this big new release that's coming out in March, and I'll talk through the timing. The tech preview 2 that we released today is what we're going to mostly be demoing. The beta release is a couple weeks away, so we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that aren't quite there yet in Tech Preview 2 that you'll see in the next few weeks rollout, and then talk about some of what will change between the beta and GA probably. That'll all be sort of the first half of the conversation, and then we'll dive into demos as Darren kind of talks through the architecture of Tech Preview 2 and sort of how Rancher 2 is different from Rancher 1.6. We'll go through and really kind of show all of the sort of provisioning and cluster management capabilities for building and deploying out your environments and your projects. We'll go through and talk about user management, auth, RBAC, policy management, how that's all coming together in 2.0, demo all of that. We'll go through the new Kubernetes workload management. We'll talk through the Helm catalog stuff that we're working on. So we got a lot to cover, and we'll try to be moving relatively quickly as we go. So with that, I'll kind of stop for just a minute to tell you a little bit. For those of you who aren't familiar with Rancher, Rancher is a tech startup that builds open source container management products. We have a handful of products that we've released over the last few years, Rancher OS being the two most popular. Today Rancher 1.6 is an incredibly popular project. More than 10,000 organizations use it every day to run containers. And so what made Rancher 1.6 so popular is it's incredibly easy to use sort of container orchestration, support for multiple orchestrators, the ability to kind of spin up Kubernetes, Mesos, Swarm clusters, as well as our own cattle orchestration that we developed in the 1.6 train. And so with 2.0, we're kind of announcing a pretty big re-architecture. We sort of discussed this the first time in late fall of last year. We had a meetup in November where we gave you kind of an early look at some of this stuff, and you can find those recordings on our YouTube channel if you just go to youtube.com/rancher. We go through a lot of detail of kind of why we're making the change and what we're doing. Now at its core level, the big change between Rancher 1.x, which was built on Docker and could run different orchestrators, including Kubernetes, is that with 2.0, we're really responding to the market that has really shifted, and most of the organizations we're working with, most of the users of Rancher are moving to Kubernetes or excited about sort of using Kubernetes as the orchestration. With 2.0, we have really focused on using Kubernetes throughout Rancher as the core orchestration. So we're moving away from multi-orchestration support and now focusing on implementing everything on Kubernetes and building all of the tooling that's made Rancher 1.6 so successful around Kubernetes. And what that means is, we're using Kubernetes now as the core orchestrator. We're still supporting cattle, the Rancher cattle experience and Docker Compose, but now we're doing that on Kubernetes. So we're making it very easy to take and deploy any applications you've run on 1.6 on 2.0 and migrate from existing cattle deployments to our new Kubernetes environments. What's really cool about Rancher 2 though is that it implements this unified cluster management for Kubernetes across any Kubernetes clusters. You can build Kubernetes clusters directly within Rancher, very easily. We introduced a project called RKE a couple of months ago, which is a Kubernetes deployment tool, and effectively automates the build out of Kubernetes on bare metal or on VMware or on existing VMs that you've got running. Or you can import or provision Kubernetes from cloud providers. So you can take Google's GKE and provision that directly from within Rancher, and Rancher will build out Kubernetes clusters using Google or Amazon's new EKS or Azure's Kubernetes service. So you'll be able to have one central control plane that manages any Kubernetes clusters and centrally define and set all of your policy, configure RBAC, do project management across clusters. You'll be able to, configure all of these things as a central organization, where any team can get access to Kubernetes and also get a lot of great tooling to make it easier to work with Kubernetes. So we're implementing a whole layer of workload management, new user interface on Kubernetes, new visibility and dashboarding into understanding Kubernetes, new monitoring, logging, CI on Kubernetes are all things we're working on. We're implementing the catalog based on Helm, but also to support compose files. So you'll have this really great new catalog that this sort of gives you access to everything going on in the Kubernetes community, as well as allows you to create your own private Kubernetes catalogs that can be really easily managed from within Rancher and shared with other projects. So Rancher 2.0 is really this fully integrated open source platform for running Kubernetes. And from a functional level, we sort of think of it as three layers. There's sort of the lowest level, which is your Kubernetes clusters, which either are existing clusters that you've deployed and you import into Rancher, which you could run however you want, say kops or build it yourself. You can provision from cloud providers, which we think is going to be really popular over the next year or so as Amazon rolls out Kubernetes as a service, and obviously Google and Azure already offer it, IBM offers it. You'll be able to very quickly use drivers to just spin up Kubernetes clusters, scale them. And the nice thing about that case is the cloud providers themselves are providing the management plane and the back end and etcd and some of the control plane for Kubernetes, so you don't even have to pay for that infrastructure, which otherwise you would have to run. Or you can spin up Rancher's Kubernetes engine, RKE, directly from within Rancher on any vSphere, bare metal, or existing VMs that you have. So build your own Kubernetes, bring in Kubernetes, provision Kubernetes from the cloud. All of these clusters then sort of are managed by this unified cluster management layer within Rancher, which is where we handle all the provisioning, the visibility across the clusters, the auth and RBAC, the policy and security management that where you set pod security policies globally and they filter down to all of these clusters. It's where we're doing stuff around quotas and capacity management and cost management for, what are you spending on all this infrastructure? Are there opportunities to optimize that? So this unified cluster management is really geared to the teams that are responsible for delivering Kubernetes as a service to, different people within an organization, within your company. The top layer is where Darren and the team have done a lot of work to really bring together the cloud native ecosystem. So we focused on developing a really great user interface. We're going to go through today the app catalog, but we're also working really closely with Prometheus, with Elk Stack, with Jenkins and other services to really tightly offer these integrated capabilities around monitoring and logging and alerting and CI and stuff they're nicely integrated and tuned with everything we're doing underneath. So you can sort of get to what you're trying to do with Kubernetes really quickly and with containers really quickly and get that same ease of use that Rancher's always really offered. So from an architecture perspective, there's quite a bit changing between Rancher 1 and 2. In Tech Preview 2, we introduced a lot of big changes. Shen, our co-founder, blogged about this today, but basically now with 2.0, the Rancher server is 100% written in Go and no longer requires a MySQL database. So we're using etcd as the data store. We're transitioning away from writing most of Rancher in Java, and hopefully this makes it easier for more people to get involved in the community in the project. We've always had an amazingly big user community of people that work and use Rancher, but we'd really love to see more people work on the project. And I'll talk a little bit more about how in the beta we're trying to sort of get people involved and get more people contributing. As always, you can deploy Rancher on a Docker host and build up a Kubernetes cluster really easily, or you can set up the management server very easily. But you can also deploy Rancher now on an existing Kubernetes cluster. So if you have Kubernetes already running, you can simply turn on Rancher and immediately get access to all of the management, user interface, and clustering, and sort of centralized unified management stuff I was just talking about. So very easy to sort of extend your existing Kubernetes deployment with Rancher. We talked about this a little bit, but you can now create new Kubernetes services just like you always have been able to in Rancher very easily, just by pointing it at infrastructure and spawning new hosts. You can decide, how to scale that, what nodes need to be management nodes, what nodes need to be etcd, what nodes are your endpoint nodes. So it's very easy to spin this up. Darren's going to demo this in just a few minutes. But you can also just launch from an existing service with your credentials. And we've done really cool work with Google to integrate GKE right into Rancher. You'll see that. And Azure's EKS isn't available yet. We've just started working with Microsoft on Amazon's EKS isn't available yet. We've just started working with Microsoft on the new Azure Container Service, which will be integrated as well. So you'll be able to really quickly pick your provider of choice and just take Kubernetes and come in and start to manage it. And that centralized management is going to be really cool for for migration, for hybrid cloud, for being able to just consistently deploy your applications regardless of where you're running them. The the auth and authorization management and security policies and all those things are going to be globally defined. So that is something that that I know for a lot of organizations that they don't have one Kubernetes cluster. They have staging and production, and many departments and divisions are using them. So this sort of centralized management of multiple clusters is something that Rancher's always offered, but we still required you to go in and work on every cluster sort of independently and configure it how you needed to. Now you'll be able to set those policies globally one time, and centralized admins can sort of configure how things are supposed to be done, what's sort of an approved policies for the clusters, and they'll just automatically get added to any cluster, any new infrastructure that gets added as you sort of centralize that. Finally, so much of this is really down to, as Kubernetes has grown, there's still just tons and tons of people who struggle to use it and understand how to take advantage of everything that's there. So much of the work we're doing is really on this workload management layer, and the work there we'll kind of talk through a bit in more depth. So we're going to talk about just the migration path, because this is something that obviously is important to everyone who's currently, I think about 60%, 70% of you guys are using Rancher in some context today, and obviously most of you are on 1.6. We have really worked very closely with a lot of existing users and customers to make sure that Rancher 1.6 environments can easily be deployed to Rancher 2.0. A lot of what we're working on with supporting Compose and 2.0 on Kubernetes is really to make it easy for existing deployments to simply be redeployed onto a 2.0 environment without having to be reconfigured in any real significant way. We aren't planning to do a sort of in-place upgrade right now. There's such a big change between 1.6 and 2.0 that our expectation is people will need to set up a new Rancher 2.0 deployment as sort of their target, and then redeploy existing cattle deployments directly on new Kubernetes projects. If you're running Kubernetes in 2.0, it'll be even easier. I mean, you'll just be able to take your existing Kubernetes cluster and either register it in with 2.0 or just recreate the deployments on a new Kubernetes cluster. The one area where we're definitely going to require some reconfiguration of the 1.6 configuration is on sort of storage and networking. We're going to provide a lot of information about that. We're looking at how to make that as easy as possible. But obviously, there's different storage drivers and networking drivers between cattle and Kubernetes, and that's an area where you're going to have to swap things out. So like new NFS drivers and different storage config will be sort of providing a lot of information there and making that as easy as possible. With 2.0, there's a new Rancher API, which will be v3. That's in the Tick Preview 2 that came out today. We're still looking at how much backward compatibility we can provide. We'd love to hear requirements from people on here or in emails to Darren or myself, or just info@Rancher or on GitHub or Slack. These are big questions. If I know a lot of people use the APIs for tons of scripting and stuff. Obviously, they're going to be pretty similar because we're supporting Compose files. There's a lot that will be there, but it's not going to be an exact backward compatible deployment. Darren, do you want to talk at all about sort of the the migration? Anything I didn't touch on that you want to cover before you talk about the architecture of the new platform?
Not really. I think you covered pretty much everything.
Okay. So why don't I just talk a little bit about the timing. So the Tech Preview 2 is available as of today. It should be up on GitHub. If you just go to github.com/rancher/rancher, you can get it. I've got instructions on how to download it in a later slide. A lot of what's there today is a really important deep gut stuff. So all the cluster deployment and management, the auth, the load balancing. We've implemented secret management. There's a lot of the workload management that's there. Secret management and workload management are both pretty big topics. They're both changing still and will change in quite a bit between now and the beta. The beta is sort of the next big release. It's when we sort of hit feature completion on everything that we want to be in 2.0. We're still working on things like volume support. We're making a bunch of changes to sort of compose on Kubernetes, which we're implementing right now. There's some external auth providers. So you'll see that in the current one, we've got auth enabled. You can turn on local auth. Just adding the support for GitHub and Active Directory for the beta will be coming there. The support for kind of just adding raw custom hosts. We're still working through a few things on that, so you'll see in the next week or two. We'll talk about the catalog today, but the Helm catalog support and sort of the new catalog implementation, we're still finalizing that. The CLI is just wrapping up, so still quite a few things that we're kind of in final stages on that aren't in Tech Preview 2. But you may see another release between now and February, even where some of these start to come in. But certainly in the February release, sort of mid-February timeframe, we're going to be releasing the beta out to everyone, and I'll talk a little bit about the beta program. We're going to continue to support 1.6 at least until the end of this year. So everyone running 1.6, it's such a big change. We have expectations that people will be on it for a long time, and we're going to support that for all of our Rancher Labs commercial customers, and obviously in the community, for quite some time. There's tens of thousands of deployments of this stuff out there. We really want to make sure that there's no jarring change, and we're going to be working even past the 2.0 beta and the release to keep making it easier for people to migrate stuff over. So we really want to make sure that everyone is able to move to 2.0 and take advantage of some of the cool stuff we're working on. So that's kind of the timing. I know there's lots of questions, and people have been asking questions. I'll jump into those in a second as Darren goes through the architecture. But hopefully you're as excited about this as we are. Darren, do you want to talk a little bit about sort of how the Tech Preview 2 architecture is configured and sort of some of the changes that we're doing under the covers?
Yeah. So the Tech Preview 2 is it's a huge milestone for us because quite a lot internally changed from Tech Preview 1 to Tech Preview 2. So when we released the last Tech Preview, we got great feedback about people were really excited about what we were doing, what we had planned. But from a technical perspective internally, we really felt that we needed to kind of go even more native Kubernetes. And so what we did in Tech Preview, basically what we're releasing in Tech Preview 2 is we re-architected the guts of Rancher to be completely based on Kubernetes and really Kubernetes native, like a Kubernetes architecture. Kubernetes, besides the fact it can deploy pods and manage containers, it's actually internally has a lot of framework for just writing applications. And so what we did was actually rebase all of Rancher on top of the Kubernetes API machinery projects and CRDs. And really, I could do a full meetup just talking about the technical details of what we did. It's really quite exciting. It's pretty neat what we were able to do with Kubernetes. But so the Tech Preview 2, it was a massive effort. Our engineering team's been working around the clock getting this out. And on the last slide, when Shannon was talking about the milestones, we have these milestones, kind of every couple weeks. We plan on still releasing the things in between because, basically now with Tech Preview 2, we did all the kind of the heavy work of, getting the internals, rebasing everything on Kubernetes, dropping Java, going to Go, everything, getting rid of MySQL. There was a lot of like major work there. But all that stuff is basically done now. We have the platform in place. So now we can kind of iterate forward with all the key features and iron everything out. So,
sorry guys, I lost my audio and connection for a minute. Darren, I just made you the presenter, but do you want me to share that back?
Yeah, can you show that again? Because I don't have the slides.
Yeah, no problem. Let me there you go. Can you see it now?
Yep.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Okay, so going back to the architecture, so the Rancher server is this box here in the center, and so the key thing about the Rancher server now is before in Rancher 1.6, the Rancher server really had two roles. It was kind of a management server and an orchestration server. If you're running cattle, it did all the orchestration. If you're running Kubernetes, it did orchestration of networking. So now networking and the load balancing. But now with Rancher 2.0, the management, like the Rancher server is purely management. So it's kind of not in the critical path of your deployments, what you're deploying day to day, whatever running. Like if the management server goes down, you lose kind of the management capabilities of, changing authorization and things like that. But, deploying through kubectl and stuff like that, all that continues to work. So in the center box here, what we have is we have the Rancher server that's all written in Go, which is talking to etcd. So we run etcd. When I actually demo this, I'll show you kind of the processes, because these boxes don't correspond like one-to-one to a process. This is more logical. But we have the Rancher server, which persists all its state in etcd. So everything else is stateless. So the HA, when we release the HA, it's pretty simple, because basically everything is just stored in etcd. We run an authentication proxy, and the authentication proxy is so that we can provide integration to like GitHub or LDAP, or integrate different authentication systems that the Kubernetes you're running might not have supported. So if you go to Google, they're going to have Google authentication, not GitHub. So we run an authentication proxy to provide that functionality. And then in there we have the cluster controller, that's managing all the clusters. And then every single time you import or manage another cluster, we spin up another cluster agent, which is really just a collection of Kubernetes controllers. But for every cluster, we have independent controllers that are running for them. So right now, if you look at the arrows, the lines that are going everywhere, this is kind of the direction of the communication. One key difference as it stands right now with Tech Preview 2 than 1.6 is the communication path right now is the Rancher management server makes an outbound call to the Kubernetes API server, like wherever the master is. So right now that connection is outbound. If you're familiar with Rancher 1.6, it was actually the opposite way. All of the nodes would make an outbound connection to the management server. So in the beta release, we'll have support for that too. It really just depends on your deployment and security requirements. Some people, prefer the management to make an outbound. Some people prefer the nodes to make an outbound. So we'll end up supporting both. In the past, we'd always preferred the nodes to make an outbound connection, so you didn't have to open up ports on all the nodes. But in 2.0, we're not talking to all the nodes. We're talking to the Kubernetes master. So the kind of the communication path becomes a lot simpler. So it's not as much of a concern to make the inbound connection. But we will still provide the reverse. So this is the
questions about etcd and whether the etcd service, I think Scott said, can the etcd be external to the Rancher server? And some people said, can I use an existing etcd that I already have? Do you want to talk a little bit just about etcd and sort of what some options are there?
Yeah. So when I demo this, I'm going to do kind of like the simple single container just run. And then when we do that, it's following the exact same pattern of how we did my 1.6 with MySQL, which is, the default is we just spin up etcd inside of the container. But if you don't want, like, that's really not the best setup because that's not really HA or whatever. So if you really want to do an HA setup, then you're going to set up an external etcd and then provide like the TLS certificates and the, you know, the kind of the arguments to configure it there. So yeah, so you can run an external one, you can run your own. Really, when you get into HA, right now we're not. There's two options. One is where you manage etcd and it's completely up to you, and then the other option is where we kind of manage it for you, and it just really depends on how you're going to want to do it. But we try to accommodate like all those things. It's just a regular etcd, you know, v3 that we need.
Gabriel asks sort of if the new etcd backend is the same etcd that Kubernetes is going to use for each cluster. Will you have sort of a Rancher etcd and then each Kubernetes environment could have their own etcd, or can you share etcd? What are the different options from an architecture perspective?
Yeah, so kind of for the standard deployment for most people who are going to be doing like real production deployments, the etcd for the management server is separate from the clusters. So you set up your own etcd for that. There is an option. It's not available in Tech Preview 2, but it will be available in the beta, which we call embedded Kubernetes, which is if you actually don't want to dedicate etcd and control plane nodes for each cluster, you want to share all of them across multiple clusters. And that's really for smaller size deployments. People are more concerned about, like, we have a lot of users who just might spin up 3 nodes, and that's all they really need. And so if you're only spinning up 3 nodes to run Docker containers, if I have to add another 3 nodes to run etcd, that's crazy. So you know, we support like these smaller size deployments. So there's really a lot of flexibility. And I mean, this is like one of the things like why we really felt it was important to go through and really rebase all this on Go and the Kubernetes architecture, is because we have a lot more flexibility in how we can deploy and manage you know, Rancher.
Yeah, lots of questions on that. I think some people were asking about that. Do I need to have, you know, in the past I could just sort of run a really small deployment. What are we, you know, are there ways to sort of shrink the footprint if I just want to kind of get a small implementation of Rancher up and running? Are you going to talk about that a little bit, or are you?
Yeah, I'll touch on it a little bit. You know, we haven't like done all the full benchmarks, whatever, but basically, everything, all indications is that if you were running like a small cattle deployment, you know, Rancher 1.6 deployment before, with the new Kubernetes, and if you do the embedded option, it should actually be lighter weight. It should be less memory. We're running less processes on the host, and the management server is much less because we moved from Java to Go, and everyone knows Java takes up tons of memory. So we believe this will actually be lighter weight. And other just interesting, cool things is we will support I don't want to say support, but basically from open source, we will be providing ARM64 binaries, which means like this will also run well like on, you know, Raspberry Pis and stuff.
Awesome. All right, Darren, you want me to pass over the ball and you can start to present?
Sure. Yeah.
And apologize to everyone. I see there's, you know, about 100 questions that I haven't answered, so I'll be working through these as we go.
Yeah. So say share my screen. Okay, so the first demo, because we're gonna break this apart in kind of 3 separate demos, so we can kind of logically group the questions and discussion or whatever. And so the first demo, I'm just going to go through the provisioning aspects, kind of what we've added in Tech Preview 2 for provisioning clusters. Last meetup, we talked a lot about RKE, which is our kind of standalone Kubernetes installer. It's real simple, real flexible. It's a really cool project. It's taken off really well. So I'm going to be showing, you know, kind of how we've kind of integrated that and the different options we have for deploying. Again, we really just want to be able to support, like, there's so many ways to get Kubernetes, to manage Kubernetes. We really want to support as many as we can because, you know, it just depends on your use case, what's the best thing for you. Okay, so the Rancher is, if you're already familiar with 1.6, the installation is still, it's similar, but there's some key differences, and I'll point those out. So you can just run Rancher as a Docker container. There is an option if you deploy that Docker container inside of a Kubernetes cluster, it will just manage that one, like it will manage that local Kubernetes cluster and then use the etcd of that cluster. Like that's great for like development if you have Minikube, or like if you just have one single cluster, that's all you care about. Like there's a kind of an optimized installation path for that too, which is even more lightweight than the Docker container. But so to run it, so in the past, what we've always had is we've told people do ports 8080 to 8080. So this is kind of the big important thing is this has changed. It is now 80 to 80 and 443 to 443. And so the reason for this is with Tech Preview 2, we've moved completely to kind of like a secure by default type setup. Authentication is always on and it's required. SSL is on and required. And so we do prefer people to run on the standard ports. It does make things a little easier, but you still can run on custom ports if you want to, like run on 8080. Just you're gonna have the best experience with as long as the first number is the same. Like you can run on like 6080 and 6443. But if you change that, then the problem is we on the 8080 port, or sorry, the HTTP port, we run a redirect, so we don't know which port to go to. But anyway, so I'm going to run this on standard ports. So the container right now, it's the same as the first preview. It's just labeled Rancher Server Preview. So if you just run it like this, basically, I haven't given it any SSL configuration, so it's just going to start out with a self-signed certificate. So if I run that, so let me see, it doesn't take, oh yeah, it's already up. It doesn't take very long since it's all written go now. It starts up pretty quick. Okay, so if I'm running with a self-signed certificate, you're going to get this stuff. Like, okay, this is not secure because we generate a certificate in a CA. Everything will actually work with a self-signed because we distribute the CA and it works, but you get a kind of poor experience in the browser. So the best thing is if you actually set up real TLS. So one option is you can bring your own certificate and you just have to bind mount those into a known location. The other option, which is the super cool one, is just use Let's Encrypt. So Let's Encrypt, let me kill this one and I'm gonna launch it again. But this time I'm going to use Let's Encrypt. So Let's Encrypt, basically the only thing in order to use Let's Encrypt, the only thing you need to do is make sure you have some DNS pointed to your server. So I've set up this DNS name that's going to this little VM. So I just need to take this domain name and then add it to the end here. So Acme domain. Acme is the Let's Encrypt protocol. Demo Darren's space. Okay, so let's bring this up. Oops, not kill. That would be bad. Okay, C. Okay, yeah, so it should be up. And if everything goes well, we should get, yes. So I think it's pretty impressive for having worked in ops and DevOps for a long time and managing TLS and all this stuff. It's pretty darn cool that you can get a cert that quick. So anyway, so this is fully secure setup using real publicly verified, everything with Let's Encrypt. Okay, so when you come into Rancher, the default password is admin. So when you do that, it's going to immediately ask you to change it. Change. Oops. Okay. All right. Okay. So when you come into the site, the first thing you're going to want
question about SSL and SSL termination. Sure. Can you still spin up? Chris asked if you could still spin up Rancher 2.0 behind an AWS ELB with SSL termination instead of having to use certs locally on the server.
Sure. Yeah, we support that too. So there's a option. Basically, what you do is when you run this here, you say HTTP only, And then that's just going to run the 80 port, not the 443 port. When you do this, you do have to, there's like another script, you're going to have to tell us what the CA cert is. We just need to know the CA cert, so when we generate kubeconfig for users, we can give them that. Unless your cert is signed by like a well-known public CA. So if it's a well-known public CA, there's nothing else you need to do. But like our site will not run, like it won't work on HTTP anymore. But if you're doing specifically SSL terminate outside, then you just say HTTP only, set up SSL termination, make sure that it's doing the proper X forwarded for headers for HTTP. So for example, don't run it on behind ELB, run it on behind ALB. If you do ALB, everything just works fine out of the box. Okay. Okay, so going back to add a cluster. So let's see. Right. Okay, so once you come in, the very first thing you do is add a cluster. And so we have kind of these three options here. You can kind of look at this cloud cluster is basically, do you want to use a cluster that's managed by a cloud service like GKE, AKS, EKS, whatever acronym you want. Or the middle option here for RKE, this is a Rancher managed cluster. So we're using our own Rancher distribution. We're fully managing the cluster. You know, we're making sure the kubelets and everything's running fine. Whereas in this one, you know, you're really relying on, like, let's say Amazon to ensure that the control plane's up. Or the last option here is just import an existing cluster. So we're going to start here with the RKE, create an RKE cluster. And so last month we had showed RKE the command line, and then we kind of like quickly showed what we were kind of planning on doing in the UI, but really none of it worked. Now this is basically all working. So the way this works is I'm going to spin up a new cluster. You have this option of, do you want embedded or dedicated? So embedded is not in TP2, Tech Preview 2. It's going to be in beta. But embedded was the option that basically you say, I want a shared control plane. This is for smaller size deployments where you don't want all these dedicated nodes. So this is great if you're just running a couple nodes. Otherwise, you can do a dedicated. And so dedicated is what we currently have. And for dedicated, this is where I'm actually going to be spinning up, you know, machines for etcd management worker nodes. So when we do this, we need to now pick like what nodes. If you wanted to, you could actually just select no nodes right now and then just add them after the fact, however you want to manage them. But this is kind of like a wizard helping you set up the whole thing. So here I want to go and launch a node. So I can just go and launch, let me see, demo. So I'm gonna do, let's say 5 nodes from DigitalOcean. So this is, if you already use 1.6, these are all the same like Docker machine drivers that just spin up the VMs in the cloud. I might have to switch to Amazon DO. For some reason, their API has been having problems yesterday and today.
You know, someone was just mentioning that in the channel that they tried to spin it up on DO, and we're seeing this sort of requirement for an admin privilege thing or something like that.
They're like, I don't know what's going on with DO. Like, I was having problems with them this morning. Like, their API is just not. Let me make sure. Okay, let me make sure I have an AWS credential. I hope this one works. We will find out.
Darren, you're going to show how you might target bare metal or VMware, right? Someone was just asking that.
Yeah, I'll talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, that one works. Okay, good. Okay, so here I'm just going to switch to Amazon since DigitalOcean, I think their API is having issues right now. So you just go through, select security groups. We're just going to let it create. Okay, so that's basically, I've just gone through and I've defined 5 nodes. Like I could go in here, like if I had different, like if I wanted different sizes for like etcd versus workers, which you probably would do, you would do this multiple times. I just kind of took a shortcut of saying, okay, like I'm just going to launch 5. But you could define different ones. So here, we could say, okay, well, these ones I'm going to use for etcd, and these ones, like this is a very common deployment where you share management with etcd. And then these ones I'll use as workers or whatever. Or, if you wanted, you can just do all roles. I mean, there's a lot of different configurations, but at the bottom, it kind of tells you, okay, like you need like 1, 3, or 5, you need at least one of these, you need at least one of those. So as long as you have, satisfy those constraints, you should be good. Okay, so here we can set up the some of the security stuff. I'm going to do that in the next demo, which we talk more about the security, what we can do with RBAC, bot security policies, whatnot.
Hey, Darren, just real quickly, I mean, there's a number of questions about this, and earlier we kind of touched on this when I was talking, but the custom host stuff that's not in TP2 but isn't in the beta, can you just explain where that is and sort of, because a lot of people are like, well, we provision our own usually. We've always used custom Terraform, custom hosts, the sort of just link, the Docker run command that was in Rancher 1.6. Can you just kind of touch on that briefly?
Yeah, so like unfortunately in Tech Preview 2, we could not get the custom host stuff done. I mean, it's so stinking close. So it will be in beta, but as I was saying, like, we'll be doing weekly or probably like weekly or, intermittent releases or whatever. So we will have that pretty soon, the custom hosts. We just couldn't get it in yesterday. And there'll be 2 options. One is to make an outbound connection through SSH. You just say, okay, here's the host and SSH, the SSH key and IP and user. That will make an outbound connection and we'll just use it. Or the second option is what we already had in Rancher 1.6, which is just run the Docker run command, which works really great with provisioning through like Terraform and stuff like that. So that will we'll have that. So like, but if you have existing Terraform scripts that are using like the Rancher modules and stuff, those will not work with 2.0 because they're all basically using the 1.6 API. So we'll be, working on updating the Terraform stuff because we have a lot of users that use Terraform. So unfortunately, the custom host, that's like kind of the major feature that we did not get into the tech preview that we wanted to, but it should be coming shortly in just a couple of weeks. It's not very far off. Okay. Sorry, okay, so the choices down here, you have different networking choices of Flannel, Calico, or Canal. Canal is just kind of a combination of Flannel and Calico. We're just gonna go with Flannel. I do wanna make an important note here. Like when you're deploying a cluster, you really need to make sure it's in a secure network. Like it's not open to the world. So there's 2 reasons for that. One is right now we are not using TLS for etcd. Like will be very shortly fixed, but etcd is not using TLS, which effectively means etcd is open to the world. And second is we're using by default Flannel, which is VXLAN. VXLAN, you have to, like VXLAN by itself is not a secure protocol. It needs to be, like basically you need to run it in your own private VPC or your own private network. So if you're spinning this up, don't just put it public on the internet. Rancher 1.6 actually worked that way because we're using IPsec and whatnot. And so we'll get to the point where, it can be just, it'll kind of be completely secure. But right now, please put this in like, a security group or something that's isolated. Otherwise, it's not fully secure.
Quick question on this. Salvatore said, would it be possible to create our own networking driver? Someone asked, will other CNI drivers be supported? Gabriel said, what about Weave for networking? Just want to talk about different options? Yeah, and so, you'll be able to supply different network drivers. And so the network drivers right now are being supplied through RKE. RKE has built into it support for the 3 that I already listed, plus Weave, that was community contributed. But what we're actually going to be doing is moving the network management up, like out of RKE into the Rancher level. And then basically what it would mean is if you want to do a network driver yourself, you would deploy a cluster and you would say, I don't want networking, but I'll deploy a custom network driver
and it just has to be packaged as a Helm template. Or we have a kind of a simplified version of the Helm template, but effectively it's a Helm template. And so these days, the way the network drivers are pretty much all deployed is through a Kubernetes YAML file. And so you just need to put it into a template. And so we'll be doing the management of that. So we should be able to, like right now, like we just have those 3 options. It's kind of baked into RKE. Once we get all the catalog support, so again, catalog is not in Tech Preview 2, but catalog support will be in the beta. And so once we have the catalog with the full Helm integration, then we get a lot more ability to kind of package and deploy those things. Okay, let me go through. Okay, so this is provisioning. This will take a couple minutes. It's building up the etcd plane. It's, it's going through and deploying everything. So let me show you some of the other options, and then I'll kind of go through and talk about the high-level management. So that was basically deploying an RKE cluster, which is a Rancher managed Kubernetes. The next one is just deploying through a cloud managed. So Amazon EKS is not released yet. Azure is, and we will have support. Like it's not currently in Tech Preview 2. It will be in the beta in the next coming weeks. We have the back end. We just need to do the front end UI work for it. So right now, in order to use GKE, you have to create this service account. This is unfortunately a kind of a complicated step. We're trying to figure out how to automate this in the easiest way, but you do need to go and create a service account with these 3 roles, and then give us the service account JSON. So once you do that, we do validate it. So like once you give it to it, we validate it. We're actually from the UI or through Rancher, we're communicating with Google now, and we dynamically get like, what are the available machine types or what version of Kubernetes you want. So here, let me spin up a Darren GKE. Go and spin up. And then, so that's really it for GKE. So AKS will be kind of a very similar flow. Again, we're trying to figure out how to make the authentic, that's always the hardest part with providers that only use like OAuth. They don't have like API keys or whatever. It's getting credentials. Okay, and then the last option for adding a cluster is the import. So I just go and import an existing one. So this one is I'm just going to use this is actually, I deployed RKE manually on a set of nodes, and then I'm just going to import that into Rancher. So like the difference between like having Rancher run RKE and deploy it as opposed to importing it is like how the level of management is. If you import RKE, then we don't really know a lot about it. We just say like, okay, it's a Kubernetes cluster. It's just any old cluster. If you use Rancher to deploy RKE, then we know specifically like how the nodes were created. We can scale them up and down and do a lot more things. So here I'm just, all you need to do to import right now is give it the kubeconfig. There's going to be a second approach to this where you just run kubectl apply. Like we had that in the last preview, but we haven't, we have to kind of redo how we were doing it, because for some clusters like GKE, for example, it's actually quite hard to find the kubeconfig. They don't actually directly give it to you. They give you like a weird generated one. Okay, so let me just import that. So importing actually goes super fast because there's nothing to do. It just imports a cluster. Okay. So now I'm going to go through and kind of talk about kind of the high-level management of the clusters. I don't know, Shannon, if there's any questions before I kind of get into going through some of the management stuff.
Oh my God, are there questions? There's tons of them. Here's a couple before we jump to this. So Nathan asked, how would you deploy this to DO without exposing it to the public internet?
Well, DO now has security groups. I mean, that's basically what I would say. So they I don't know, to be honest, a lot about it, but they do have, is it firewalls? Yeah, I'm not super familiar with it, but they do have firewalls. I don't know. This is one of the things of why I really want to bring so we switched to. It's kind of interesting. So Rancher 1.6 or Rancher by default is IPsec. That's the networking we always use. And the reason why we've done that is it's secure out of the box. When you go into the Kubernetes world, it's IPsec. Basically nobody uses it. There's nothing out of the box to support it that we found to get it's kind of spotty. So we have been considering re-implementing the IPsec implementation in Kubernetes, which actually should be really quite simple and a pretty solid approach. Because I do want to be able to say that, hey, you can just spin it up in DigitalOcean with no firewall and it works. But that's just not the case right now. And that's actually, honestly, anybody running Kubernetes right now, a lot of people don't realize this when they're running Kubernetes in production. If you're using VXLAN, Flannel, it is not secure by default. There's even if you put a firewall, you put security groups and you say, oh, okay, I can only allow inbound on the VXLAN UDP port from these IPs, that's not actually secure because it's UDP. It's easy to spoof it. You can get traffic in. So it's a lot of people just don't even realize that. So there's a lot of people out there running insecure stuff, unfortunately. Okay.
There's another question people asked a little bit about air-gapped networks. There was one about private clouds deploying on private cloud nodes. I think the private cloud nodes stuff is it seems like that's really going to be using the custom driver stuff that you mentioned. For air-gapped networks, anything you can talk about there? Are there any gotchas or issues that people should be worried about?
Well, right now, if you're going to pick up the Tech Preview 2 right now and run it in an air-gapped setup, the one thing you're going to run into is the images needed by RKE, which are actually running on the host, which are the kubelet and some of the flannel stuff. There's a couple of the images. I think we have them listed in the docs. Those will have to be pre-staged on the host because if you're going through the UI, we don't have a setting right now for what's a custom registry. RKE actually natively supports it, but we haven't put it into the UI. So that's the one gotcha right now is if you're going to do that in an air-gapped network or you need to use a private registry. We don't have from the UI support for private registry, so you effectively need to pre-stage the images onto the host. As long as we find the image already on the host with the right name, then we use it. Air gap will, of course, be fully supported. That's a very common and important use case for us. And private registries and all that, it's very common, all this in enterprise. Okay. Should I keep going?
Go ahead, Darren.
So all my clusters are provisioned, and so I want to kind of talk through kind of the management capabilities and kind of how we've structured the UI and stuff like that, so you can kind of understand what we're looking at here. At the global level, this is where we've defined things that when you're working at a global level, this is where you can set up things. It's mostly security right now. These are things that are applicable on a global level. You just want to define it once and then it kind of applies to all the different clusters and whatnot. And so what we have up here is node drivers. These are global catalogs. There will also be per project catalogs. I'll talk about projects. I might say projects a couple times here. I'm going to talk about it more in the next demo. But so I'll come back to that. But okay, so at the highest level, so you have the user management.
Hey, Darren, before you move on there's a bunch of questions about under pods. What does the 330 mean, or what is the magical 330 pod limit? Do you want to just kind of touch on that real quick before you move on?
Oh, sure. Yeah, the pods here this is just an interesting Kubernetes thing. So kubelets by default, a kubelet has an arbitrary maximum number of pods. So the default for a kubelet is 110. So you can kind of so I have 3 worker nodes. This is actually 3 worker nodes, but no, what was it? 2 worker? I can't remember. But anyway, so it must have been 3 worker nodes. So so basically each host can only run a maximum of 110 pods. It is a configurable thing. You can bump it up, but that's the default right now in Kubernetes. And so we show that. I mean, so basically, because sometimes if you're running a lot of containers, then basically you're going to hit the number of pods first before you actually run out of memory or CPU. What we're showing here, these numbers here, this is all the scheduling information. I just want to like this is not actually live usage. This is what capacity is available for the scheduler. So it doesn't mean your nodes right now, like the way this works is this is the minimum, this is the maximum, this is the average. So what this doesn't mean that currently the CPU is at 45%. It means currently 45% of the CPU has been allocated. So you're like, if this goes up to 100% memory, it doesn't mean that all your hosts are using the memory. It just means that like people have reserved the memory. You can't schedule anymore. Okay, that was slightly a tangent. Okay, so the things we have up here is, so I can see the nodes, all my nodes across all the clusters. Oh, okay, this makes sense. Some of my, oh shoot, this is whatever. Some of my nodes failed to deploy. That makes sense. Okay, so then these are the node drivers. So again, these are the same Docker machine drivers we had in 1.6. There's a lot of them. When you enable catalog, you get a lot more. This is just the ones we have that are built in. Users, I'll talk a lot more about this, and then managing security, I'll talk more about that in a bit. So the way we break this up is we have global, then we have cluster level, and then project level. Project is where you start getting down to where I actually deploy pods. So now if I go to the cluster level, I can kind of see things here. I can just see the nodes for the cluster. I can see where all the namespaces, what are the projects, and then the security for the cluster. We expect here we'll end up having like storage and networking where you can define cluster-wide storage like volumes, because like persistent volumes are actually at a cluster level. So you'll see volumes here. You'll see network policy, network driver. The policy will be at a global level. So we'll expand this out. There'll be a lot more things here in beta. But so this is global, then you have cluster, and then you have the project. So the project is where you actually get down to actually like deploying pods. So let me see. So once you get to a cluster, we have this kind of dashboard, shows you that this capacity. We have kind of separate efforts in place right now to kind of build up like more live metrics using Prometheus, and that's kind of like a whole so this is just basically the scheduling data at a high level, like live metrics and Prometheus and cool dashboards and graphs is kind of coming in a separate project that we're working on. But here is where basically you can get the kube config, so you can get access to the cluster. So this would basically generate the kube config for you. So one thing you'll notice is the URL here points to the management server. So the management server is running as an authentication proxy because we're authenticating it first with Rancher. So like when we do GitHub authentication or whatever, it'll authenticate with GitHub through our authentication proxy. Then it goes to Kubernetes. So you don't have to worry about whatever authentication system the native Kubernetes supports or the cloud provider. Because we just consistently do that for all your clusters across, wherever it's deployed. Yeah. Okay. So that basically wraps up the most of the kind of the deployment and kind of provisioning and management of what we have right now in Tech Preview 2. And so all of this, we spent a lot of time. So like Tech Preview 2, like the important things for us to get was we wanted to get all the core stuff. We wrote all the stuff in Go and rebased on Kubernetes, got all that done. And then we wanted to make sure that these two levels, basically kind of the global and cluster level, that these were well ironed out. I mean, of course, there's still gonna be bugs. But at this point, like this is functional. Like this is not like demoware. So just kind of give you an idea of the quality there. All right, Shannon should.
So there's a couple questions worth kind of just chatting about. One of the questions was about sort of federating and multiple clusters and the like. Do you want to talk a little bit about sort of Kubernetes native federation and sort of the unified management inside of Rancher? And can you kind of cover that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, so federation. So this is kind of the neat thing is now that we're managing multiple clusters, you can kind of see them all at once. Like the way we had done it in 1.6 was they're very disjointed because they're like in completely separate environments and you couldn't get a good overview and whatnot. So now we have a better view, and so it really opens up the capabilities of what we can do for federation. And this is what we're seeing a lot of requests for, like for people like DR scenarios and whatnot. So we are looking at Kubernetes federation. We'll see where that goes. I'm not super optimistic right now about like that we'll be heavily leveraging the native Kubernetes federation capabilities because they're pretty quite basic. And when you want to get into a DR scenario, it gets a lot more complicated. So it's kind of like, why is there a need to write an etcd operator versus just deploying it as a stateful set? It's like the built-in capabilities of like the orchestrator, kind of the generic approach is usually not sufficient. You need like more specific knowledge. So what we think is really quite interesting is the idea of writing controllers that run across clusters. Because we already are effectively doing that today, because we write these in that architecture that I showed you before. There's this component called the cluster agent, and the cluster agent is controllers that are effectively subscribing to two separate clusters and then managing the state between the two of them. Because like we define all the security and policies and whatnot in the management server, and then we synchronize that state down to the clusters. And so this really opens up like that capabilities of writing these controllers that can basically move workloads between clusters and handle that. And so we're looking a lot at that right now. So again, I don't know, like I think the Kubernetes built-in federation stuff is a little too basic. But as we work with users and customers on specific like DR requirements, and we will, probably be developing like specific controllers for those things. They handle certain like deployment scenarios.
Horace was asking, how does Rancher V2 manage Kubernetes upgrades? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we don't have any of that in the UI right now. But basically, I mean, it's pretty straight. Like the capabilities is pretty much what's the version of the control plane, what's the version of the nodes. So we have a lot of the backend work of this done, but it's not in the UI. And so basically you'll be able to go and say, okay, upgrade the control plane to the new version. And so it'll roll out and upgrade. So it all depends on how what type of cluster you have. So that either means we're talking to like Google or Amazon to calling the API to upgrade, or if it's like RKE, we're doing it ourselves. So we roll out the upgrade. So then once you have the control plane upgraded, then you roll out the nodes. So the nodes, we'll basically just upgrade the nodes kind of one by one, kind of in order right now. We don't have like fancy logic around like batch size and whatnot. I imagine we'll probably add it because once you get to a large number of nodes, but right now it's just basically, I think it's sequential. But besides the upgrading effectively like the kubelet, that's really what you're upgrading when you're upgrading Kubernetes. Besides that, like in terms of maintenance of nodes, we'll also be adding like basically cordon and cordon and drain functionality, just basically in the UI and whatnot. So you can easily just so if you want isolate nodes and workloads for maintenance, so you can say like don't schedule here anymore, or get everything off this host so I can do maintenance on it or reboot it.
Darren, are we going to demo a little bit about HA of sort of the Rancher backend at all in this, or do you want to cover that in a minute?
No, so we don't have it fully implemented. I mean, it's honestly, it's not rocket science. Everything that we have in Rancher it follows the Kubernetes architecture now. So basically, what we need to do is the reason why we don't have HA right now is because our controllers are not running the leader election code that's in Kubernetes. So it's a really quite simple thing. But If you were to run 2 Rancher servers, then you'll end up with 2 controllers that will stomp on each other. So we just need to be running the built-in leader election capabilities, and then it'll scale up. So the HA setup is basically, have an etcd and then launch 2 Rancher nodes, like 2 Rancher containers. There's going to be an option where you can, if you don't want dedicated etcd, you can run it inside of the Rancher containers. And then so at that point, you just run 2 or 3 Rancher containers, and then make sure that the disks, lose, that's effectively running a database. So make sure that you're running good storage, I guess.
So a couple of people had asked, can I import a Mac, sort of Docker for Mac Kubernetes or Minikube environment? Is that possible?
Yes,
more about the import cluster feature. Can you demo that at all?
Yeah, well, yeah. So I demoed that. I mean, there's really not a lot. It's just basically give me your kube config, and then we import it. As long as we can talk to it. Some of the issues we've had with like when you give a kube config is whether or not you're using valid SSL. If you're not using valid SSL, then we have problems. Or if you're using custom auth, like the way Google does it, we can't actually get the credentials because it actually requires calling another program to get the credentials. But you can, but I don't know if it's in the documentation, but we need to post it. Of like basically the preferred way if you're running Minikube or like Docker for Mac. Honestly, I haven't tried on Docker for Mac, the Kubernetes. Hopefully everything is like, it's not a weird setup. Everything's just normal. But the preferred way to do that is you deploy the Rancher server container as a pod in Kubernetes. And then what it does is when you run the Rancher server container in Kubernetes, it will detect that it's running in Kubernetes, and it will use the Kubernetes control plane. Actually, I forgot to show you this. So let me show this a little more of. So if I go, so I'm running this container. So if I go into this container here, okay, you'll see. Basically, we're running. Oh, gotta fix that. Okay, so we're running 3 processes in here. So Rancher, this is our API server. So this is our Rancher server, and then we launch etcd, which again, you could move this out if you wanted to. And then we run this API server. And what this is it's actually a lightweight Kubernetes API server. Because the way Rancher Management Server runs is it's actually running a tiny little Kubernetes setup. Like it doesn't manage pods or anything like that. It's just managing resources. Like it's like a glorified database for us. So what happens is if you run the Rancher container inside of a Kubernetes cluster, it will see that it has, like it's in the cluster, and it won't run etcd or the API server, and it will instead just talk to the Kubernetes instance. And then it registers the cluster itself. Like it registers the cluster as like a local cluster. And so if you're doing like Minikube, that's the best way to do it. So basically, in order to do that, like you need the Kubernetes YAML to set up the service and deploy the deployment, like do the deployment and the service. So we have that, but I'll make sure it's posted and documented so so people can easily do it. It's just right now it like that we haven't given as much testing to that approach as the standalone, but we very much want that to work because in the past we've kind of always felt like Rancher was too heavyweight to run to run it on like your laptop, but it's really not. So it's like it's really not anymore. Like here, I'm managing a couple clusters, so the memory footprint's a little higher, but normally the memory footprint, like the resident, will be somewhere around like 90 megabytes, which given it's a Go program, it's a decent size. Like that's not too bad. So it's like not taking up a huge amount of memory. So it's like you can actually just run it on your laptop and use that to interact with Kubernetes.
Darren, can the Rancher server run in a VM instead of as a container? Gabriel just asked that.
I mean, all it is just a Go program, but we really prefer to run it in a Docker container just because it's like we know exactly what's there. So it's like, for example, like in order for this to run, we need to have like Docker machine, and it's a specific version of Docker machine that we use. And so like there's certain things on the command line that we need available. So it is possible. It's how we develop it. We don't develop it in a container, but we really do prefer to run it in a container. Honestly, we haven't had much, like most people haven't really complained much about that, but I don't know. If we get more requests, then definitely can. Again, it's just a Go program. Like it really is. Like even this is just some fancy fork magic that what it's doing. Like these 3 binaries are actually all embedded into this one binary. So it's just one big Go program.
There was a question just asked. Chris just said, I noticed that this is being recorded. Will the video be available later? Yes, absolutely. We will make the video available later. Okay, Darren, why don't you keep moving? I'll keep trying to answer questions.
Yeah, where are we on time?
Okay. We're getting into about 11:15, 11:20, so we've been going an hour and a half.
Okay. 20. All right. So now I want to go in and talk about kind of the security RBAC type stuff that we have in here. So going back here, so again, I briefly had mentioned projects, but didn't really talk about what they are. So projects is a concept that we've introduced specific to Rancher to manage things. Because when you look at Kubernetes, basically, you've got 2 things. You have a cluster and a namespace. So when you're creating resources, you either do it at a cluster level, you do it at a namespace level. So if I have a lot of clusters, then I need to, do that same management over again. If I have a lot of namespaces, I need to basically manage all those namespaces. And so when you start looking at deployments, like things like secrets or RBAC role bindings, things like that, a lot of the management it actually ends up being at like the namespace level of like what you're going to do. And so the reason why we introduced projects is we wanted to be able to basically say, okay, here's the project, and I'm going to set up like all the security, resource constraints, secrets, and stuff like that. Like kind of define everything for the project, and then any namespace that gets created in that project automatically gets, those settings or whatever. So this gives us like one level of administration so that somebody can go and set up a project and configure it, properly, and then an end user can come in and use that project, and it's much more self-service. So that they can go and just create namespaces, and they're automatically populated with the right rules and whatnot. Because one of the things that we've seen is like while the RBAC capabilities within Kubernetes are very powerful, because the way they work with like strict escalation, like you can't escalate and whatnot, which is good, obviously. But it requires you to go to somebody else to get access to something. So if I wanted a namespace created, I would most likely need to go to a different group or whatever, and they'll create a namespace for you. And so we wanted to be able to make this so that 1, it should make administration easier. 2, it should make self-service for people much better. So like users can just easily go and create namespaces. And so that's basically what the project is. It's a collection of, right now it's the RBAC rules, pod security policy, secrets, and then resource quotas will be coming. So that's currently what's kind of managed at the project level. Okay, so as I talk about RBAC, basically, when you're adding users to the system, there's 3 levels of authorization that you can do. There's the global level, at a cluster level, or at a project level. So if I go here and I add a user, here we're using local authentication. So I actually need to add a user because I'm creating like the user record. But if I was using like GitHub or LDAP or AD, like those providers are coming. In those situations, you're not actually adding the user, you're just basically authorizing the user at a global level. And so here I can go and create a user. So I'm going to create a user, Darren, set up a password.
Hey, Darren, are projects across clusters or
no, they're not. And we get that asked a lot. So projects right now the project only exists within the cluster. Like we tried to figure out how to make projects cross clusters, because everyone always says like, oh, like that'd be really great. But like when you start getting into the actual use cases of how you do things, it starts falling apart. And we haven't been able to figure out a usable model of how that would actually work. And a lot of times what people want is like, well, I just don't want to have to create multiple projects. Like, how can I share the configuration? And so we're kind of really trying to dig into the specific requirements and like making sure we can do like the most usable thing there. So that one is like a still open-ended thing, because I think every time we explain projects, people are like, oh, can it work across clusters? We're like, no, it doesn't. But we haven't figured out, exactly like why or how it should. So this is like the best model that we found so far. But this is why we open this up for users to use it. We want feedback. Figure out what works, what doesn't. Sorry, let me. Okay, so I'm creating this user, and so here these are global permissions. When I'm adding the user, I'm giving them global permissions. So these are not permissions that are specific to a cluster or a project. These are just like global to Rancher itself. So like you can have a standard user or an administrator, or custom. And so custom kind of gives you an idea of what different capabilities we're kind of messing with. So you can say whether or not the user can like create clusters or manage. Manage means like they can actually see all of the clusters and change them. So like as a regular user, you just say like, oh, I'm allowed to create a cluster. That's like in our default standard users, like anyone's able to go and create a cluster. And then they have permissions to that cluster, but they can't see someone else's cluster. Configure authentication catalogs. Basically, if I scroll up to the top here, all of these top level things, you can control like what people are allowed to do up here. So whether or not they're allowed to have access to any of these type of things. So it's actually totally valid to give somebody no permissions at a global level, because you're just like, well, you don't need to do anything at a global level. Like you can just, I'll just give you access to this project or this specific cluster. Okay, here I'm just going to create a standard user. Sorry. So once I do that, let me open up another window here and log in again as that user, so I can kind of show you as I'm doing things. Okay, so come in here. So you can see here as an admin, like I was an administrator. Like when you default come in, you're an admin. So I went and I created 3 clusters, but like as this user I logged in, I can't see any clusters because I haven't been authorized to anything. So again, like the default behavior of a standard user is like I can go and create a cluster, but I can't see anyone else's because I wasn't like invited to that cluster. So if I go to the cluster here and go to security, I can then define the members of the cluster. So then I can say, okay, I'll make Darren a member of the cluster, which gives them like kind of default user level privileges. You can be an owner, which means you can kind of do anything to that cluster. Or again, there's custom. So custom is, breaks it down to all the individual things. So like create a project, cluster members, nodes, whatever. So here, if I just say, okay, I'm a member. So now I made Darren, he's a cluster member of this cluster. You can see it already popped up in this UI here. So now I can see that cluster. So now I can go in. But if you notice, like if I go to projects here, there's no projects. Like I can't see anything because I was given access to the cluster, but I wasn't given access to projects because that's a different level. Again, there's like 3 levels: global, cluster, project level. But so I can't see the projects. I can't see the project because this project had been created by someone else. But like I could go in here as this user and I can create my own project, but it's going to be my project. But like, let's see if I go here to nodes, like I can see all the nodes because I was given that privilege. But if I go back here to like security, let me remove myself so I'm not just like a member. I'm going to do something custom. So I say, okay, I'm Darren custom. Or say he's allowed to create projects. We'll just do create projects. Okay, so that's it. That's all I'm allowed to do, create projects. So now if I refresh here, you'll see I'll have no nodes. So you can control, basically everything that someone can do at this level. So again, like, so we kind of break this up of like, like at the very top level is where you define all the roles. Like the roles that I've been clicking on, these are all totally configurable. They just break down into basically Kubernetes roles. So we have a bunch of built-in ones that will handle what we think of like kind of the normal use cases. But you can go and create like custom roles, and they inherit from other roles. And these all just get translated into Kubernetes roles and role bindings, and cluster roles and cluster role bindings. They just get translated into there. But you can create, basically as many as you want. So like at the global level, you define the roles. Like you only have one set of roles that's global for all clusters. So it's like, this is kind of like the super highest level of administration. And then you might want to just set up like cluster admins who can just go and administer their own cluster. And then for your users who are just like doing their day-to-day deployments, that's when you get down into the workloads of like, okay, now I'm gonna just add them to the project. Sorry, I didn't really show this. Let me go back to projects here. When you go and you list projects here, so I have this default project, and you go to namespaces, as I was saying, like the hierarchy, if we went one level deeper, it's like project, and then below that is namespaces. So namespaces are a member of a project. So like right now, the default namespace is in the default project. But if I wanted to, sorry, I'll just show you this real quick. Sorry if I'm flipping around too much. Like if I go into this, you see there's no workloads as like replica sets and whatnot. There's nothing here. But if I go back here to the project and I say, oh, let me move over the kube system namespace, let me move that into this project. So now it's a member, like that namespace is in that project. It's going to get all the authorization and everything applied to it. So now when I go back here, now I actually see all those names, like all those workloads and stuff. So again, so the security stuff, it goes all the way down to the project level. So as I was kind of saying before, these two levels of global and cluster, like that's where we put a lot of effort in for Tech Preview 2. This bottom level project, this is unfortunate, like this is where we're still doing a lot of the work. This is where some things are incomplete. But down here, when you get into the member of the project, we don't have it right now, but when you get into custom, you'll end up seeing things like view nodes, create nodes, not nodes, sorry, this is a project level. So it's like view or create pods, create ingress or service, basically the different resource types that you would have in Kubernetes, so you can control that. So at the end of the day, I mean, you just have a huge amount of flexibility. This is the stuff that it's like we always wanted to do in Rancher 1.6, but it's quite a bit to kind of invent your whole authorization system and everything and figure it. So this is one of the things we're really excited about moving over to Kubernetes and really focusing on Kubernetes, is that we have a really kind of sound implementation of authorization that we can build upon, so we can actually do really good fine-grained fine-grained stuff, but also not make it super complicated. Like, you can just, it's pretty easy to just say, okay, like I'm just gonna have this user and they just work in these namespaces, and just set that up, and it should work fine. Kind of the last thing within security I wanted to talk about was, besides the roles and RBAC and stuff, there's pod security policies. If you've dealt with pod security policies, they're a little funky. They don't really work the way, it's not the most intuitive, I would just say. Pod security policy is basically what type of pods can I launch? And so you're allowed to create pod security policies. You can say like whether or not they're can run privileged or use host networking, if read-only is required. There's all these different settings basically of what type of policy. So you can go and you can create like a secure pod security policy. So like users can only do secure things. The way we manage this right now is you can set a pod security policy at the cluster level. So if I go into the cluster, I think it's here. I edit. Nope. Where was it? It was on create. Anyways, so the pod security policy, you can do it at the cluster level, like because I know when you, let's say if I'm selecting it, I can say what the pod security policy is here. You can do it at the cluster level, and that means like absolutely everything in the cluster is going to apply to that pod security policy. Or you can assign a pod security policy to a project. So you can say this project They're not allowed to run privileged containers. So that's how you can manage those right now. It's we're trying, like, it's hard to make the pod security policy super flexible because there's a really odd behavior in how it gets applied to pods. But that's kind of the way it is right now. Pod security policies, like, we have a lot of the UI right now in Tech Preview 2, but it's not fully implemented in the backend. So we're still completely flushing that out, like figuring out the kind of usability of it. I think that, so Shannon, I think that wraps up most of what I want to show around, I think, security and the RBAC stuff.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, Darren. And most of the questions, I mean, there's lots and lots of questions. I've still got 100 or so that I haven't been able to get to, but and Denise is helping with some. So I appreciate everyone asking lots of questions. Don't stop, slow down. We'll stay here until we get them all done. And then as someone asked if I would post these questions out, I'm going to put them on the Slack channel, so I can export the whole thing and stick it up in Slack. I may need to sort of pull off some private ones that people have sent, because some of them they've asked to be private. So I'll have to see if I can do that easily. There were some other questions, though. Darren, I would say one big question was just, there's a lot of terms that seem to have changed between 1.6 and 2.0. Stacks, environments are now sort of, and the concept of projects. There was a couple questions about that, though I think most people got that it's a group of namespaces. But can you just sort of talk about sort of how we're balancing sort of exposing all the Kubernetes terminology as well as sort of keeping it, trying to make it really usable?
Yeah, and so because I'm kind of like the first to say that, like, a lot of the Kubernetes terminology is confusing, but it is becoming more and more the standard place. It's becoming more standard that people are talking about pods and replica sets, like they know what those are. So it's becoming a little bit more widely known, the Kubernetes terminology, but still it's confusing. And we really, the way we've always worked in the past is we want someone to, as long as you know Docker, like I know what a container is, I can launch a container, then you should be pretty comfortable with Rancher. So we really don't like the idea of, like, okay, first, take a 2-week course on Kubernetes and understand how it all works. So, like, that's never been our intention. We just want to make it simple. So kind of what the approach of what we've done just from terminology is, like, basically we try to use the Kubernetes terms if as long as they make sense. If they don't make sense, then we might end up kind of, instead of using the term directly, just kind of describing what it is. Like, instead of saying ingress, we might just say, like, well, load balancer, because that's really what we want to do, or a HTTP load balancer. So we're trying to, make it as usable as possible so people don't have to know a lot of these concepts. So that's kind of like just the general approach of how we're naming things. But then there's the question of, well, moving from 1.6 to 2.0, all these terms changed. And I think that's an important thing. We should make a note of that, of basically kind of writing up, what's the analog between the two systems. Because before in Rancher, we had environments. Environment is effectively a cluster now. And then we had stacks. Stacks line up with namespaces. And then services are basically what we're calling workloads. And workloads in Kubernetes is a collection of a bunch of different types, with, like, replica set, replication controller, daemon set, job, cron job. There's like 6 or 7 types. So I think we should probably, kind of document that somewhere, like, what's the relationship. But once you kind of figure out where the terms match, the user experience should be pretty close. And like, I'll show you here, like, when you go down to, if you're familiar with 1.6, it's like, this is a namespace. It's basically the same thing as a stack. So if I had multiple namespaces, they just show up all here on this screen as different groups, because in Kubernetes, in 1.6, a namespace was technically, it was a boundary for service discovery. And that's what a namespace also is. A namespace is, obviously it's a space for names. So, it basically, it really is, gives you a naming boundary. And so it ended up mapping fairly well. So most of this stuff, the biggest one, I'll tell you that the biggest one is load balancer. Like, the load balancing capability we had in 1.6, when you move to 2.0, it's quite different, because Kubernetes really takes a different approach on how to do load balancing. And so we have not finished, like, that stuff in the UI. and we're trying our best to make it as usable as possible. Because there's just a lot of quirks on, like, if you want to set up like HTTP load balancing, like layer 7 load balancing, it's like you set up an ingress which points to a service which then selects pods, and you know, for a newer user, it's just kind of it's a lot. So you know, we're trying to figure out what's the best usable approach for load balancing. But besides that, like even volumes is going to be very similar user experience. Because and the reason why a lot of this stuff maps fairly well is because when we built Cattle and all those concepts, kind of our approach on how we did it was that, like, you know, we wanted to build all this Docker native stuff, but we had a huge appreciation for Kubernetes and how they did things. So we really looked at Kubernetes and kind of say, okay, well, that's a good scalable pattern. Let me kind of try to do the same thing in the Docker world. And that's what we did with Cattle. So Cattle internally, the way it worked is very similar to Kubernetes.
Darren, one question that came up, a lot of people were asking questions about sort of testing on bare metal or VMware. And with TP2, what would you recommend for people who aren't on Amazon or DigitalOcean and aren't using a cloud provider? Is there a good way to test this out on some bare metal hosts or VMware hosts? I
mean, the best way to test it out is really to run RKE from the command line and then import it into Rancher. Again, I mean, it's a bummer. Like, you know, if you just give us like 2 weeks, we'll have this all built into the UI. But right now, as it stands, because we don't have like the custom host support, it's probably the best way for like VMware bare metal is run RKE from the command line, which is a pretty simple program. There's a meetup. We did a whole meetup on it last month, so you can go back and look at that video. And then that will spit out a kube config. Then just register that in, and that's effectively what I did with this one here. This is just an RKE cluster that I manually deployed somewhere else.
Thanks, Darren. Why don't we jump in? I think there's tons of people asking questions about accessing Kubernetes and using the user interface and Helm and Prometheus and things like that. Do you want to just dive into that, and then we can always kind of just roll back to answer more questions?
Yeah. So this is kind of the last step one. It's just basically going over this last level here of workload. So again, this is the most raw. Like, as you click through here, you are going to find like, hey, I entered a 3 and it didn't do anything, or there's bugs and whatnot in this, and we're still ironing out the kind of user experience. Like some of these even these top level things here, workload, ingress, DNS, we'll probably change some of that and figure out what makes sense for users. So this is the one where we're doing a lot of work still. But so the basic idea here is, once you get down to the project level, is the project, as this was described before, the project is basically a collection of namespaces. So the view that you see from a project view is you're going to see all the namespaces in the project. So it's not just one individual one, it's going to be multiple namespaces. So this is all stuff that was like deployed just, you know, through Kubernetes, the kube system. So anything that's deployed in Kubernetes is just going to automatically pop up and you're going to see it. We give visibility to that. Plus, you can then deploy from our UI here. And so like here, like, you know, we try to make this as simple as possible. You say, okay, deploy, you want to deploy a pod. You just want like just a standalone pod. You want to create a workload of scale, 3. Do you want to create a global workload? We'll probably change some of the terminology here, but this is basically a daemon set. This is for setting up pods with multiple containers, but there's more options that'll end up being here for a cron job, and there's different types. But basically, like, between all those different workload types in Kubernetes, it's like they're all basically, you define a pod and then you say, how do you want to scale it? So it's pretty much all the same workload. It's just, like workflow. It's just like, well, how do you want to scale it? It's slightly different how you want to scale. Right. So then so then we have all the various options of command and network. All the millions of options you have on the pod. You can do that all from the UI. So it's very easy to just go and deploy a pod, scale it up. The import is not working right now, but basically you'll be able to import Kubernetes YAML or compose files for our 1.6 compatibility. And then you also be able to export too. So you can import and export. Just going through, so I'm just going to kind of click through and I'll show you that this will give you, again, this is all pretty rough on the workload stuff or the project level stuff, but just to get an idea of the capabilities that you'll just get from the UI. So this is be able to control ingress. So basically you can just say, okay, just target, some of these buttons are completely wrong with the terms. But you can just say, okay, like I want to create this, this path, ASDF on this host, myhost.com or whatever is going to route there, and then use these SSL certificates if it's doing TLS. So that's all the ingress stuff. DNS, this is actually the service discovery. So you can basically, like when you create services in Kubernetes, you're kind of creating just a name, like an entry, and so it's you give it some name like this, so you can say, okay, this can be just an IP, an external host name, which is like a CNAME. You can target other services, so we just say this service actually goes to that service, or it can be a set of containers with a selector. So if you're already familiar with 1.6, this really maps to like our service alias and DNS service, or I can't remember exactly what we call it in UI, but this maps to kind of those concepts we had though. But this is just kind of like a simpler way to describe what the Kubernetes service is doing, because service is really it's really just for the most part setting up. It's a load balancer and DNS for the most part. And then volumes, we don't have anything in volumes quite yet, but this will be the full management of like PVCs and stateful sets, which corresponds to how you use the PVC. When I get up to this stuff, these resources here, these are all different types of secrets. So when you go and you add like a certificate, you can do this. You can say if you want it available to all namespaces. So basically, because the way Kubernetes does like all the secrets is they're all namespace level. So basically, like if I create a new namespace and I want to use a secret, then somebody's got to put the secret in. But there's a good chance that whoever added the secret is not the person deploying. So we move all the secret stuff to be, it's possible to manage it all at the project level. So you're effectively defining it in the management database, and then we'll push it down. We'll push it down to every namespace that's part of the project. So here, let me see, so we just do some kind of nice things so you can manage the certificates. Like I'll show you. This is like a test certificate we use. Oops. Sorry. Oops. Cat. It's easier if you just open the files, but I don't have them on the computer. Okay. So the one that goes in, so this cert will automatically be available to every namespace that's available in there, and then we automatically tell you like the information, so you can know when it expired and what's the serial number and stuff like that. So that's the certificates. Registries, these are actually registry credentials, so you can add credentials. So same thing, you can do it at the project level or namespace level. So I can say just in this one namespace, I'm going to add this credential so that pods can then use the poll secrets, image poll secrets. And you add whatever username and password there. And the last one is just arbitrary secrets. So those are the things that we right now are kind of putting into the workload management UI. We will still give access to, like, the user can always download the kubeconfig. They don't have to use our UI or our CLI too. They can just use download the kubeconfig and then just use kubectl. We will have like embedded shell. We had that before, but we had to temporarily drop it, where you can just click a button and you just get the kubectl right there and you can just run it. And then before we gave access to the Kubernetes dashboard, that one's still on the fence whether or not we'll do that. Like once you add RBAC, the Kubernetes dashboard experience becomes kind of poor. But if you still want the dashboard, like Kubernetes dashboard, the open source one, we'll probably still give access to that. Once you get down to the project level, this is where you'll be deploying catalog applications. Again, we didn't quite get catalog into the tech preview 2. We've moved everything to be based off of Helm. So it's 100% Helm. But all of the Rancher 1.6, like the catalog format that we have for 1.6 is still supported. It still works. Basically what we do is we internally take the catalog templates that we had in 1.6 and we turn it into a Helm template and then deploy it. And so we're using Helm. We're doing some, I would say, some creative things with Helm because it's quite hard to manage the security with Helm. So we had to do kind of some creative management of how we can actually use Helm, but still maintain the end user privileges and all that. But we basically got all that worked out. But so in the next release, we'll have all the catalog stuff working. But catalog, the experience is basically the same as what you see in 1.6. If you're not familiar with that, I can probably show real quick, like on. Oh wait, no, I can't log in here. I'm not logged into GitHub.
Hey Darren, there's a ton of questions. I think it's okay not to show the catalog.
Okay.
I think most people can see it pretty easily. One question I had though is, there's a number of questions about this. What's the best approach for sort of backing up etcd both at the Rancher master level as well as at the cluster level? Rancher 1.6 did a lot on that area. Leandro was asking how that might work in 2.0.
Right. So there's 2 ways to do backup. I mean, so there's the etcd native backup. So there's documentation and whatnot on how to do backup through etcd. So basically you can create a backup, basically a snapshot, and then back that up, and then you restore from it. So that's available. We're actually looking at a kind of a simpler approach to doing backup, because when it comes down to it, there's not a huge amount of information. So I'm talking about the management server, not the individual clusters. But when you look at our management server, like what we're actually putting into etcd is like not a huge amount of information, and it's just effectively a bunch of JSON documents that we're kind of looking at the ability to do a backup that's more programmatic. So you can just say schedule backup, and we just write a zip file. Because it's a lot easier to manage than doing the full etcd style one, but the etcd style one is available. So in the past, the way that we've done things with Rancher 1.6 was we just used MySQL, and the reason why we used MySQL was because there's a lot of operation, like you can either get it hosted or like people can basically figure out the operations aspect of MySQL. Usually there's a lot of information out there. There's a good amount of information about etcd, but there's just not as much expertise. And so as we move into 2.0, we do expect that we're going to be taking a lot more ownership of how to run etcd and how to manage it, what's the best way. And so there'll be like information to kind of help people out in production. Yeah.
Darren, another question that came out, a number of questions about ingress. Gabriel said, are you supporting UDP for ingress? There was another question from Eugene saying, if I wanted to use like example.coms, do I need to point its A record to the Rancher server's IP? I think Randall asked, if I was running it on-prem, how are load balancers handled? In other words, how do we get traffic to non-HTTP services? Do we need to use something like KubeRouter, or does Rancher provide something? Do you want to just kind of talk about ingress a little bit more, maybe answer some of those questions?
Yeah, this is kind of why I'm saying why we're still working through some of the usability on this, the workload stuff, is because like when you get into like ingress, for example, there's so many options available that it's kind of silly. Like, so it's like, will we support UDP? So basically UDP support depends on the ingress provider. So like we're going to have support for configuring what's what's the ingress provider or controller. So like if you're using, I think I don't know, I think Nginx does it, maybe. So like depending on which provider uses what features. And so basically what we're going to try to do through the UI is cover most of the annotations that are available in the ingress. So like if you go and Nginx is a good resource. Like the Nginx controller has like 1 million annotations, and then they kind of show you which other ingress also support it. And so we're trying to figure out what's the best way to do that, of like, give people all the options, but then, if their ingress controller doesn't support it, then it doesn't work. Like there's no like capabilities API that exists today. So like we're still working through that. And so it's like, how exactly, like, so right now I'll tell you, like when you deploy RKE, we don't even deploy an ingress controller. Like you kind of have to bring your own right now, because we haven't fully figured out what's the easiest, most usable way to do it, because there's so many options. And then it gets very confusing when you contrast capabilities of ingress with services, because like both technically can do TCP and UDP. Why would you use one or the other? So basically all this is saying is like, it's a complex topic, and we're basically working through this, trying to figure out, it's like the solutions are all out there. Like, basically whatever you want to do, there's probably a way to do it. Like somebody's probably already thought of it in the Kubernetes world. So we know the solutions are there. Like what we're really focused on is like, what's the best way? What's the easiest way? Like, kind of what's the best practice? And so we're still working through it on the load balancing stuff.
Any comment on when or where will the V3 API docs be available? In terms of docs, what's the current situation, and where can people find those?
Oh, I think we could probably make, because the docs are, Denise can answer that. But if anyone's seen our API before, like our API has like a built-in UI for it. So you can just, like, if you wanted to figure out, it's like, well, how do I go and create a machine, for example? So you can just go and create a machine, and there's the fields, and when you click like show request, it prints out, gives you the curl command. We've been working on a newer version of this API UI that's even fancier. Don't know when that's coming out. That's kind of a side project. But so most people, I'll tell you, there's our documentation, but I'll tell you the way a lot of people figure this stuff out is either through the API UI, what I just showed you, or they run if you run the developer tools, you can just watch, because our APIs, it's a very simple API. Like it's just a very simple structure and whatnot, so you can figure it out pretty quickly. But we should be able to, so our docs are basically generated from our API. Our API has a schema in it. It's like self-describing. So we can just generate the docs, but there's not going to be like all the text describing everything. So anyways, that documentation will for sure be there by the time we GA, which will be March. I don't know if it's going to be in beta. That I have to talk to Denise about. She's kind of in charge of that.
Guys, there's so many questions that Darren, was there anything else you wanted to show from a demo perspective?
No, I think I covered most everything.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's basically it.
Just being mindful of time. We're about 2 hours in, and I'm stunned to see there's still hundreds and hundreds of people on here asking tons of questions. So what I was thinking we could do is let me just wrap up and talk a little bit about the beta program and how people can sign up. Then we'll get into questions, and I'll just sort of kind of go back through these questions and start asking you some verbally, and we can try and wrap them up. People can drop if they're not interested in the questions. But I appreciate you demoing so much today. I think there's a lot more we probably will be demoing in the next month's meetup as we kind of finished up a lot of these features. We didn't talk too much about CI today. We didn't talk about global secrets. Did you cover secrets at all?
No, I mean just showing them, but there's the whole secrets management. Yeah, there's a lot more stuff that's coming.
Yeah, so lots and lots more to cover, and I know there's so many people that have more questions. But why don't I take back control for just a second? Everyone can see my screen now. And just to kind of wrap up on the concepts, these were kind of the demos we were doing. To get started, yeah, the easiest thing, as we said, is to sort of import a Kubernetes cluster from RKE or spin something up on one of the cloud providers, or wait a couple weeks until the custom host thing gets there. Play with TP2. We love your feedback. We really think this is the first real release people can sink their teeth into, get a feel for what's going on. But it is still pretty incomplete. There's a number of features, especially on the user experience side. There's so much on pipelines and monitoring and stuff that we haven't put in yet either. But we do have this Rancher 2.0 beta program that you can pre-register for. It's going to have access to special Slack channel for people that are really doing beta testing and have lots of feedback. There's also going to be, we're going to do some fun prizes because we really want to get more people contributing to the GitHub site. So anyone who's filing or fixing bugs is going to get lots of points, and we're going to have some fun prizes for everyone who participates in the beta, really. So if you're posting on the forums, answering questions, posting on Slack, answering people questions, we've got a little program to kind of figure all that out. And for the top people who really contribute, we've got some cool awards. We've got this really neat Lego set to build out your own Rancher cow that is going to be just the ultimate in swag for this year. So please join. You can just go to info.rancher.com/rancher2beta. You can see the link below. If you can't find it, feel free to just tweet at me or hit us up on Slack. Where do I sign up for the beta? I'm sure we'll send it out in an email to everyone who attended and didn't attend today's conversation. The quick start guide for all the docs and stuff is just up on docs/rancher/v2.0, and you can see there's a quick start guide. You can find a link to this on our website as well. As always, the GitHub pages for Rancher, for RKE, for Rancher OS are open and open to everyone. If you love Rancher, give us a star. If you really want to help, ask how. Feel free to jump into the Slack where we really would love to get help. A lot of the things we're talking about, drivers for different kinds of machine drivers for different kinds of networking engines, support for different kinds of storage systems, support for different operating systems. There's only so much we can do as a group, and with tens of thousands of people using it, we'd love to see more contributors, working on the project. When 2.0, I think it's going to get easier and easier to contribute. So much of the product is sort of broken out now into really easy ways. So please jump in and get involved if you're interested. And with that, I'll say thank you, and we can kind of turn over to diving into the questions. Darren, I'm gonna pass the ball back to you, and you can keep your demo environment up so that if you want to show some of these things, we can do that. Otherwise, I am going to I'll just sort of go through some of these questions as we go. Sound good?
Sounds good.
So one question, I'm just looking some of the ones that have come in most recently, but there was a question someone asked about the recording. I'm going to try and put the recording up today in the next hour or two. So I should have it up quickly. You keep an eye on the YouTube channel. Keep an eye on just our Slack channel. I'll put them up on Twitter and stuff when it goes up. There was a question that Bala had. He said, how do we scale the masters in Rancher? How many hosts or clusters can a single Rancher master run? Do you want to talk about that, Darren?
Right. So we haven't fully tested what this scalability. I mean, right now, we're looking at hundreds of clusters. So I mean, I think our target, to be able to say in GA is that we can probably say like 100 clusters. I mean, assuming that those clusters themselves are also, good size. The scalability, to be honest, actually is not how many clusters, it's how many nodes. Because the nodes is effectively going to be so it's how many nodes can we manage. So everything's pretty lightweight within Rancher. Our biggest concern is events. Events is a general concern in Kubernetes of how to manage those. And so we're fairly confident like this thing will scale pretty well, but the events will most likely have to be moved off into a separate data store. Kubernetes already has some built-in support to kind of move that to a different etcd. But we're looking at it and seeing if we actually need to write just a custom storage backend for events to go to a different, like more something like time series or something that's more oriented to collecting that like streaming data. But anyway, so I don't know. So we'll see as the beta goes on, and as we get closer to GA, exactly what the number is going to be around scale. I mean, we're pretty confident it's going to be there, but I can't tell you the exact numbers. And we already have customers lined up who are at a pretty large scale. So it's important for us to kind of hit that. So
you were saying you can scale it up horizontally by adding more Rancher management nodes, and is there some performance monitoring that sort of happens that I could see that, or how would I know when?
Right. So like the bottleneck basically just ends up being etcd. It's really how quickly can you communicate to etcd. So you can add more management servers, and that's really just to manage the kind of the number of you get a little bit more compute, but like our management server is not really compute intensive. So scaling up has more to do actually with TCP connections and the amount of bandwidth that's coming from the clusters. So it also depends on how busy the clusters are, like if they're generating a lot of events and information. So the reason why I bring up events is because we actually do aggregate the events at the management server, because we're kind of grouping the events by cluster and projects and being able to show that to you. It's not in the UI right now, but we have it in the back end where we're aggregating all that stuff. But anyway, so it's basically how can you scale etcd. The management server, you can horizontally scale those, but that's not as much of a concern.
Cool. So here's another question. Jose said, can you replace the container engine in Rancher to use any other OCI?
Yeah, we don't actually care, right? So like if you were running, the Hyper-V or Clear Container, like one of those OCI engines. So it's like basically our level of compatibility is with the Kubernetes API. So we don't really care what OCI runtime. I mean, if you're going to be like a paid customer, then we do care because we support the entire stack. But for our open source users, by all means, you can run whatever you want. There's no technical limitations there. That was actually a problem we had with like the first tech preview, was that it didn't work with any approach. But now the way we've re-architected things, you can get a cluster running with Kubernetes and it looks like pods. The OCI implementation is good. Then we'll work with it.
Can you talk a little bit? There was a question that Leandro asked. He said, will this version have a native integration with Jenkins or maybe a Jenkins plugin developed for you guys? Thanks again. Do you want to talk about that, Darren?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have something. We've been working on it. The kind of the effort started. The effort started a couple of months back, but as we redid the tech preview, like kind of the approach, the internal architecture, we've had to adjust that project too. But we have a CI/CD project coming out, which currently is based on Jenkins. We're looking to see if we might use a different engine. But it's a very simple yet capable CI/CD workflow where you can just basically define a pipeline of triggers, build, run commands, run a deployment, push an image. So we have something that we've been working on, and I really hope because of the amount of effort that we've been putting into Tech Preview 2, we haven't really been able to showcase that. Now that we can kind of pay attention to that, hopefully we can maybe do that in like one of the coming meetups, show what we're doing there.
There was a question, lots of questions that came in at different times about this, and I wanted to ask you about it, which was, Alexandra asked it pretty well. He said, most of the people are looking for something more advanced than Nginx as an ingress controller. We're looking for solutions like Linkerd, Envoy, and Istio. What are Rancher's 2.0 plans around service mesh, and do you want to talk about that a little bit, Darren?
Yeah, right. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not really happy with ingress and service the way they work. We're putting a lot more focus long term in service mesh. We really think that's the way to go. so it's kind of basically what we're doing right now is we just have to have support for ingress and service because that's kind of the current state. And so if we don't have that, then it's like, well, people can't use what they're currently doing. But no, we don't really think you're going to get super far with using like Nginx controller. We are looking at, as like, basically once we have 2.0 in place, 2.0 is like our core platform, and then we have all these projects that we're kind of doing in parallel that build on top of 2.0. It's kind of like bolt-ons or add-ons to it, all still open source and everything. So we have like one effort specifically around service mesh, but that won't come out until after 2.0 GA. It's a combination of like we really think that's the way to go. We don't we still think service mesh is a little early in terms of like users being able to kind of understand it. They're at that level where they need it, and the maturity of the technology. There's some really cool projects that are coming out right now around it. But anyway, so yes, we're heavily looking at this. Like we believe a lot in the service mesh and that approach.
Here's a question Andre asked. He said, what about webhooks? Will they be available? We're currently using webhooks for automatic service upgrade.
That one I'm trying, like, so right now, because we kind of basically, we dropped the webhooks implementation that we had in 1.6. We don't have it in 2.0 right now because it was very tied to like the whole implementation. Like it wasn't even actually like the webhook implementation wasn't even like a lot of code. It was pretty straightforward, but it was very tied to the way Rancher 1.6 worked. So it didn't work in Kubernetes. We'd like to bring back webhooks, but the question is, because we have this other effort for the CI/CD product that allows you to define a pipeline, is that we might do webhooks more in that approach of like, because kind of what we had before was just kind of like one-off webhooks that would just do some arbitrary things. We might focus our effort in more of like defining a pipeline, and then the webhooks is kind of built into that. So that's where we kind of stand right now. So it really kind of depends on timing of things. If we feel like we're not getting the CI/CD product out fast enough, then we might just implement webhooks in the style we did before, because it was very simple. But I think by the time for 2.0 GA, like we should have a solution there. I'm just saying, like, there's two approaches. I'm not exactly sure which one we're taking. I prefer if we just do something that's a little more full featured and is focused on pipelines.
So Alexis was saying, webhooks for scaling can be replaced by horizontal pod scaling in Kubernetes. Does Rancher have a plan to handle this? And Salvatore was just saying webhooks for automatic scale through Prometheus monitoring was really a great feature. So just some more thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, so there are. I mean, this is one of the great things too. It's like, if you're looking for like webhooks or scaling, it's like, this is all still Kubernetes. There's a lot of solutions that are out there that you can find that are going to run on Kubernetes. And so horizontal pod scaling will work in Rancher. That's all basically just depends on the capabilities of the cluster. Let's see, RKE, I don't think we have we're not deploying the pod autoscaler. So, but it's just an add-on that basically you can put in. So we do have plans. Like we have kind of, with some other things we're doing, we've basically architected for the fact that like we want to take advantage of that horizontal scaling, because the stuff that they're doing in like the beta, like, because there's two versions of the API. The first one is just like based off of CPU, and it's really basic, and to be perfectly honest, not very useful. CPU is not a great metric to scale on. But there's another one, the newer API, that has arbitrary resources or arbitrary metrics that can be collected from like Prometheus or Heapster. That one's a lot more interesting. Yeah.
There was another question that Alexei asked, or Alexei, I think it's how you say it. Sorry, Alexei. He said, will the internal DNS and internal load balancing be available in Rancher 2.0? And do you want to just talk, I mean, we kind of talked about this already with Ingress, but maybe you can talk a little bit about the internal DNS in addition to the load balancer.
Right, yeah, so I mean, so basically this is one change that you'll see from like going from Rancher 1.6 to 2.0 is that we are adopting all of the Kubernetes standards of how they do DNS mapping, which are very close to what we did before, but has like if you're actually using the subdomain of Rancher internal, that might not work. We're starting to see if there's any workarounds for that, but like as it stands right now, we're just using what's available on Kubernetes, which means that there is internal DNS. So like that's what like this tab here is actually controlling is the internal DNS within the cluster. So what DNS is available and what it points to. And then there's internal load balancing built into Kubernetes based off of services. And that's a layer 4 approach through TCP and UDP. You can do load balancing. So that's already available. Again, I mean, I really think longer term service mesh is really a much better approach to all of this, to service discovery, routing, all these things. The service mesh does a much better job than some of the stuff that's available. But anyways, but we do deploy, like, so in RKE, we do deploy kubedns by default. We really would like to switch to core DNS as that becomes more, hopefully that becomes more of the standard over kubedns.
William asked, will pulling in a new Helm catalog item spin up a new namespace like a new stack is currently created in 1.6?
Right. So the support that we're doing for catalog, so basically what we do is when we run Helm, so the way Helm works is a Helm client and then Tiller is the server. There's some security problems around that because Tiller runs with its own credentials. They don't reflect the user. So we've done some interesting things with Tiller that basically we pretty much manage Tiller at a per namespace level, like dynamically on the fly. And so what you do is when you deploy so if you're using Helm through our tools, so this is a catch. I'll explain like native Helm and then what happens with like native Helm and then Helm the way we've integrated it in Rancher. So if you're deploying a Helm catalog through Rancher, basically whoever is the end user who deployed it is going to get that's who the permissions of the deployment will reflect to the end user, which means if you can create it, like it depends on if that user can create a namespace. By default, we allow people to create namespaces because namespaces just get assigned to a project and then they inherit the privileges or whatever. So what will happen is when you do a Helm, when you deploy through Helm and it goes to Tiller, it uses the privileges of that user, which creates a namespace. The namespace automatically will inherit all the project rules and then you can deploy. So like an end user, if they're able to, let's say, I don't know, like if they don't have access to create secrets and they deploy a Helm chart that has secrets in it, then it will fail because they don't have access to do it. So we try to manage that whole RBAC end to end. So that's what it works in the way that Rancher is today, or the way that like it's integrated into Rancher. Native Helm is different because if you just run like Helm and Tiller yourself, then Tiller it runs as a service account and it basically just has all privileges. You can lock that down, but then it's like basically you only have one level of access control on Tiller. So you can only, so basically anybody who accesses Helm has the same level of privileges as Tiller does. So if you allow Tiller to do anything, then anybody can do anything. If you lock it down, then everybody's locked down. So it's not like the best experience. The other thing is when you create a namespace, in order for that namespace to get registered with a project in Rancher, you have to put an annotation on it, or maybe a label. I think it's a label. You have to put a label on it of what's the project ID. Once you put that label, then we take over the authorization of that namespace. So if you're doing stuff outside of like namespaces and stuff outside of Rancher, creating them, that's the one thing you do have to do, because otherwise you'll just create the namespace and you have no privileges whatsoever. Yeah.
Alexis said, can Darren show us how to retrieve kubeconfig for RKE cluster on our laptop to be able to do a basic kube control get pods, please?
So like if I ran RKE on my laptop, like how do you get the kube config?
Yeah.
Is that what it is? So basically, like when you run RKE, like so you're going to say RKE up. In the current directory, it creates a file that's .kube config something. I don't know, like we're going to change this. I don't know why there's a dot on it because it just basically makes it hidden. But like when you run kube or RKE up at the very end, it says like this is your kube config file. But basically it puts it into the current directory, but it starts with a dot, so it's hidden. So you have to do like ls -la. I don't know exactly why we made it hidden, but we're going to change that. So that's how you get the kube config.
Okay. Here's a question. Gabriel said, if you already have a cluster running on ARM64, like a Kubernetes cluster running on ARM64, can you import that into Rancher?
In Tech Preview 2, you can. Yes. I mean, so the short answer is yes. Yeah, you can. Because the way we do it, like in Tech Preview 2, we don't deploy anything. When we import, we just purely talk to the API. In beta, we are most likely going to be deploying an agent, but the intention is the agent will be a multi-arc template. So then it should just pull the right one. The only catch is like we're going to support ARM64. I don't know if we're going to support like 32-bit, like HF or 7. Well, I can't remember the other variants. But it should. So you should be able to import an ARM64 cluster today.
Cool. Alexis, sorry, not Alexis. There was another question that that was about the the K8's kind. So is Rancher going to support the K8's kind deployment? Currently in TP, they show up weirdly as single pods if deployed with kube control. Does that make sense? Do you know how to support those? That question makes sense?
I don't know if I exactly understand. I mean, so like basically like when we're going to be looking at workloads, there'll be a column here. We haven't added it for kind that will show what type they are. And then so basically they show up like it'll show here and it'll say like this is a daemon set or it's a deployment. And then we associate the containers to it and like that's a pod with 2 containers in it. So it's like 3 pods there. That's kind of how we group it. And then if it's a deployment, like a deployment creates a replica set, which then creates pods. We don't show the intermediate one. Like it's an internal detail. So we just show like deployment to pods. So we just show you that or whatever. And so a lot of the replica sets that get created by deployments we don't even show. But that, I don't know if that answers it, but in the current preview, like it was very like we basically kind of took like the cattle view of the world and then kind of put Kubernetes into that. And in the newer like tech previews, we've kind of reversed that of like, well, let's start with kind of the Kubernetes view of the world and then try to simplify and make it a little easier for people to understand. So the terminology and stuff will has changed between the previews, and then hopefully like we really want to make sure that like the product makes sense, to like a Kubernetes user, like somebody who already knows Kubernetes. Makes sense for it to exist, like for somebody who already knows Kubernetes really well, but then also is easy enough for somebody who doesn't know Kubernetes, which is a trick. I mean, it's hard.
Can you talk about Windows Cube or any limitations around that? Brian asked. Sorry.
I mean, Kubernetes on Windows?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I mean, yes, we have every intention. Like we're working with Microsoft. We're talking to them. We very much will be supporting. This is actually really quite because we do have users and customers who run Rancher 1.6 with Windows, and it's with Docker on Windows, the way it's been approached is kind of bumpy. But we're really excited with the stuff that's been going on with Windows and Kubernetes, and Microsoft supporting some of the Kubernetes like native concepts and everything. So yeah, so I mean, basically as that matures and that becomes available in the Microsoft world, we'll be supporting it. And you know, because of the architecture and how we've approached things in this tech preview 2, I mean, it should just basically work, because as long as it conforms to, you know, it's a Kubernetes endpoint, it's Kubernetes API, things should work. So you know, we're working with Microsoft as that matures.
So there's another question. Gregory said, is Avi supported right now as a load balancer? I know Avi was in the catalog last in 1.6. Do you know if there's any special support for Avi?
No, I mean, we haven't done anything like us specifically for it. I don't know. So it's like basically like we had in our catalog before, if there's an equivalent Helm template, and if it works as like an I guess an ingress controller, but I don't know if that exists. So I'm not terribly sure. I'll have to look at that.
We actually have we have 2 or 3 big customers, you know, really big banks that use Avi with Rancher. So I'm sure we'll have to look at it as we go through the beta and just and see if there's any special work that needs to be done to make it work. I know Avi worked with Kubernetes really well. I've talked with them about it, so I anticipate it shouldn't be an issue. But there's no, you know, I don't think we've done any special work with them yet, you know, on that. Ganeshan asked if on the policy side, when you're setting policies, do the policies we have in there correspond to Docker bench security recommendations or something different? Can we create custom policies? Do you want to just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Docker bench is really a superset of what's available, because Docker bench looks at some options and whatnot, which are more at the system configuration level, not at the kind of deployment configuration level. So this would be a subset of those things, but whatever they're recommending, we can do that. Unfortunately, there's not actually like because I've seen some people, more security-minded people, put out like recommendations of here's a good pod security policy, but I haven't actually seen like, you know, something that's more like a standard or from like kind of like certification world of like, you know, this is what you should be running. The intention is that we will, so again, pod security policy in tech preview 2 is not fully implemented in the backend. The intention is that we will have a couple built in that seem like they're secure. And so we have a couple references out there of what's, you know, of what, you know, people think is a good secure configuration. I don't think right now, you know, the kind of the state of Kubernetes and multi-tenancy is if you're running multi-tenancy, you still are kind of in a trusted, you kind of trust your peers a little bit. Like it's a lot harder for people to set up something where they do full multi-tenancy with untrusted neighbors. Like it is possible. It's like that's what OpenShift does, but like the way OpenShift is running is like a lot of Red Hat specific technology. So it's not like generally applicable to Kubernetes.
Okay, so a couple, and guys, we still have lots of questions here. If you asked your question an hour or two ago and I haven't gotten to it and you still want it again, please ask it again, because we're going to wrap up in a couple minutes, and I'll try to get back to people if we don't cover it already. But if you have a question you really want to ask, please send it in one more time. This was a good question that Ronan just asked, and I think it covers what a lot of people were asking about. Erkin had asked earlier, is it possible, you know, he'd asked, you know, will Rancher 2.0 support multi-NFS server setup, and would it be possible to target the NFS on the current running server where the container is currently located? And I think Ronan just had asked, you know, volumes was a long time discussion, and volumes backups too. What are the plans about volumes inside nodes, about migrating volumes through nodes, about backup strategy? What about storage drivers? There were a couple questions about different storage drivers, cloud storage drivers, VMware volumes. Do you want to maybe just talk a little bit? I know we haven't added storage into the tech preview 2, and it'll be part of the beta. We'll probably cover it on the next meetup in more depth. But do you want to just maybe talk a little bit about sort of the architecture of storage and Kubernetes in Rancher 2 and how you're kind of approaching it?
Yeah, I mean, I think storage in Kubernetes has kind of been just as bumpy as any storage in any container kind of ecosystem. So kind of the future and the direction going forward is CSI, which is a kind of a new standard. And so we are really looking at focusing on CSI implementations for storage. But there's still like some gaps in capabilities in terms of like I actually think that like what we have in 1.6 for the volume management is actually has more capability than what's in Kubernetes, and so we're trying to see if maybe we should write a couple controllers to handle kind of some of the use cases that we had before. So that's like what some of the like we're still working on that. But in terms of like backup and snapshot, like those things, like because kind of the storage world is not super mature in the container space, like those things, like basically they're just still trying to get like volume, like just provisioning and scaling and managing volumes right now, right? So it's like there still is nothing in the snapshot world. Like there's no like standard API for the snapshot world. We do have like a sub project that we've had for a long time, Longhorn, and we will be bringing Longhorn into Kubernetes. Hopefully more into the product, and that does have like snapshot capabilities and whatnot. And so we do have like engineers right now specifically working on Longhorn, and that's a whole different meetup in itself to talk about what we're doing there. But like that would be like a specific implementation of storage as opposed to like we could give you snapshot and backup if you're using Longhorn, but just for any generic Kubernetes workload, there's no solution. Like, yeah.
I think that's fair. All right, cool. So what kind of drivers should we expect in the preview, in the beta? What are the ones you're focusing
for
on?
storage?
And if there are other Kubernetes drivers, will I be able to just import those?
Yeah, so you can use any driver. So basically, we're not going to prevent you. Like, so we'll probably all the built-in drivers. We should probably, will allow you to use those or whatnot. The ones that we're going to care the most about or look, is basically the same things that we're supporting today, which is pretty much NFS, EFS, and EBS. Those are like the ones that we still see are the most popular. NFS is still very, very popular. So there's a couple different approaches to NFS, and so we might have like built-in support for like the external NFS provisioner. We're doing some of our engineers kind of looking at the kind of compatibility, because like we in 1.6 and in the Docker world, we kind of had to implement all of our own drivers for the stuff we supported. So there's like Rancher NFS and EBS, and we're making sure that we have like feature parity between what we had before and what we'll have going forward. And so NFS is the one that I think it's a little, we might have to do a little bit of work, but I can contribute that upstream to get it to work the same.
Right. Okay, a couple more questions. I've got 3 or 4 more. Feel free, you guys, fire in new questions if you need them, but we're going to wrap up pretty soon. I know we've been on for 2.5 hours and I need to use the restroom. Dominic said, is it possible to implement a kind of multi-tenancy with one single Kubernetes cluster deployed with Rancher? For example, label some nodes and deploy pods for a customer only on the labeled nodes. And how easily can that be achieved? Sort of, multi-tenancy within a cluster. Any thoughts on that, Dave?
Yeah.
Darren?
So I mean, it works for. So basically, what you're gonna do is like, that's why we kind of created this project concept. So you have a, basically you set up a cluster and you just have 2 separate projects and they're on the same cluster and people just deploy their workloads and they don't see each other. So the one thing you do have to do is make sure that you set up the scheduling properly. There's I can't remember the name now, but there's an emission controller that automatically sets like resource constraints to make sure that everything gets scheduled with resource constraints. As long as that's done, then the scheduling will work properly and then it should work pretty well. So multi-tenancy, I mean, it's fairly good as long as you trust, like there's a certain level of trust. So it's like, you don't want to run, like You don't want to set up your own multi-tenant cluster where, tenant A might try to hack tenant B, because there are security, like, even like the stuff that Meltdown and Spectre, and, it's like there's things that people can attack neighbors. So if, it's fairly trusted, so like this works really well in an enterprise because it's like it's multi-tenant, but you don't expect like two different projects to be attacking each other. So it works out well. So it's what's the comfort, and trust of the tenants. But beyond that, like the resource scheduling and the isolation and the concepts and everything, it all works out pretty well.
Cool. Jason said, do you expose Rancher? This is actually kind of, Salvatore asked sort of a similar question. He said, do you expose Rancher Kubernetes, Rancher/Kubernetes/host metrics to Prometheus via API? And then Salvatore said, question about external services that Rancher will use for stats and logging. Do we need to guarantee the resources for the projects, or will it be everything in Rancher-server container? For example, Prometheus master and Fluentd. Do you want to kind of try and answer both of those questions?
I don't think I quite got the second one. The first one, we're running everything on top of Kubernetes, and like so basically all of our code is pretty much Kubernetes controllers and whatnot. And so we will be trying to, like, so Kubernetes has already built in a lot of metrics. And so we'll be trying to expose that out. It's not there yet. That's kind of more within kind of the scope of getting all the metrics and stuff is more like after we get beta out, as we head more towards GA, and we really make sure it's production worthy and whatnot. But again, since it's all built on top of the Kubernetes infrastructure, there's already kind of built-in metrics gathering, and so you can get an idea of like what controllers are running and the queue sizes and the failure rates and stuff like that.
The other question Salvatore asked was, so let me see if I can repeat it. Question about external services that Rancher will use for stats and logging. Do we need to guarantee the resources for the projects, or will it be everything in Rancher-server container? For example, Prometheus master and Fluentd.
Right. So all of those, so we like the Rancher server container or the Rancher server master, those are not going to be running any of those components. So those are all going to be running in the cluster. So if you're running Prometheus or Fluentd, they're going to be running in the cluster. So right now we're not deploying anything by default. We do have like a Fluentd feature that's coming, and also one that requires Prometheus. But yes, you're basically going to have to need space for those resources in your cluster. And then basically through like taints and tolerations and whatnot, you can just isolate specific nodes. So a lot of people will run, like Prometheus on like more of the control plane nodes of the cluster. But kind of the important thing is none of that's going to run in Rancher server. It's all going out to the kind of the clusters, and the main reason for that is just like scalability, because we are managing multiple clusters, and so we don't want everything kind of coming back to one central place.
Awesome. Last question, guys. We're going to have to wrap up, but and I apologize. There's 130 questions I didn't get to today, and I know I say we always will get to all the questions, but even with all of them we've answered, there's 130 more. So I will try to answer them in Slack or maybe write some blogs to answer some of these that are really good. But Ronan said, Docker implemented snapshots recently. Does Rancher 2.0 or will Rancher 2.0 support it? Do you want to talk about that, Darren?
I'm not aware of that. I mean, I know in like the Containerd implementation of Containerd, there's something that's called snapshot. There's a snapshot driver, but that does not, like, it's no different than just saying like kind of like Docker commit. I mean, the snapshot driver is what basically creates layers. But I don't know. I'll have to look at that because I'm not aware of like a snapshot support for volumes. Like they've effectively always had snapshotting for the container because that's what a Docker commit is. But that's typically not what people are looking for. So I don't really know. I'll have to look into that.
Awesome. Well, on that note, We will, Kari just said, can you please make this written Q&A available with recording? I will try. There's some private questions people send, so I've got to figure out how to remove them. But where I will post that is to the Slack channel. So there's your incentive to join the Slack if you want. If you haven't already, join. It's slack.rancher.io. It's very easy to pull it up. But with that, thank you. I mean, there's hundreds of you still here. We had almost, I think we may have just missed 1,000. I think we had 967 people on today's meetup. So you are in great company with a lot of really other smart people that are checking out Rancher 2 and Kubernetes and Docker and moving to this stuff. So Darren, thanks for working so hard on this and working so hard on Tech Preview 2. I know there's lots of work still between now and the beta. If you have any questions, I'm Shannon at rancher.com or at SMW355. Darren is at iBuildTheCloud or Darren at rancher.com. We're always here to answer your questions. So we're also hiring, like really hiring. If you're looking to join our engineering team, or interested in joining our field engineering team, if you're a DevOps expert and you love Rancher and you want to work on it full time, we have open recs in the US. You can see them on our careers page. We have open recs in Europe. So always looking for great people to join the team if you're interested. With that, I'll say goodbye and thank you all for coming today. Have a wonderful rest of your day, especially everyone over in Europe who's been with us in the evening so long. So, good night, everyone. Good day, everyone here, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks.